King Kong is perhaps the original monster movie, and the escapades of the titular giant gorilla have been remade and parodied and referenced hundreds of times across the rest of cinema. It's also inspired numerous filmmakers, one of them being New Zealand auteur Peter Jackson. Kong's home has always been the mysterious Skull Island, and in Jackson's 2005 remake, the Forgotten Land had never been so richly detailed before. And not just in the film too. Following its release, much of the concept art and ideas were collected and repurposed in what served as a tome for the island's fauna and prehistoric origins. It's this book, as well as Jackson's film and all of its ancient inhabitants, that will serve as the backbone for this video. But the first question anyone may have is, when did anyone get the time to name and write down all of the dinosaurs and other wildlife, as it attempted to eat or trample the crewmen of the USS Venture in their search for Ann Darrow? Well, that part only came after, both after the mission and the death of Kong himself in New York. Following the unveiling of Kong to the Western world, there was a chaotic scramble to reach Skull Island. Universities and scientific organizations clashed for funding and justification rights in the mad race to be the first one to land on Skull Island. Of the numerous expeditions planned, only a handful made it to the island, and 6 of these were woefully underprepared. The people had rushed to the island like lambs to the slaughter, and with similar results, as these early ventures had a huge loss of life. After a year of tragedy and disaster, the 3 largest parties jointly managed and funded a new expedition, and it was led by none other than Carl Denham himself. Launching in 1935, Project Legacy was a 3-month voyage upon the island to map, discover and categorize this new land. The main discovery of these 3 months was that it would take a hell of a lot more time to even scratch the surface of the island. As such, Project Legacy became an annual expedition, with the intent of setting up a permanent field base on Skull Island. Sadly, this was not to be. In the second expedition of 1936, a huge earthquake rattled the island. A chunk of coastline sank beneath the waves and caused the deaths of 5 team members. Following this, through geological study, the truth became clear. Skull Island was doomed. The island sat on the cusp of the Australasian and Eurasian tectonic plates, and for years had been crumbling back into the ocean. Even when the Venture first landed on it, it had already shrank to a fraction of its original size. And in 1945, after just 7 Project Legacy expeditions, and a mere 15 years after its first discovery by the West, Skull Island disappeared forever. A cataclysmic earthquake shook the island, and this time tore it to pieces. The landmass sank beneath the waves and dragged the last of the great reptiles down with it. The warm freshwater swamps were flooded with icy seawater that wiped out the delicate inhabitants. The unique bird life and other flying animals that were able to take off in time likely survived the initial shock, but none were suited for transoceanic crossing and likely perished over the ocean in their attempts to find dry land. Any hardy reptile species surviving on driftwood may live through the cataclysm, but upon reaching another landmass would not have enough numbers to form a new population. In the case of animals like the Skull Island monitor or egret, if they ever found land again, they would be robbed of their genomic purity, as they were absorbed into another species. In a heartbeat, Skull Island and its inhabitants vanished from our Earth, and all that was left were the bones of its long-dead king, thousands of miles away, forever kept in a jungle of concrete and steel. But Project Legacy didn't come away empty-handed. Hundreds of new species had been uncovered that were totally new to Western science, and in their time on the island they had made more zoological discovery than perhaps any other period in time. All this was categorized and classified in notebooks, journals and sketches to tell the rest of the world of the amazing life that once persisted there. So join me and together we'll explore the world of Kong, a natural history of Skull Island. To anyone who had successfully located Skull Island, the challenge began before you'd even set foot on land. The same forces crumbling the island produced a jagged outline near impossible to land ships on, and littered the surrounding coast with rocks and ruin. These forces also made it a marine paradise for anything that lived beneath the waves. The well-mixed turbid waters, nutrient upwellings from subduction trenches, and a great variety of underwater habitats from the sinking rock provided the ocean with the perfect conditions to absolutely teem with life. Rich, diverse fisheries unexploited by the global north fed dense flocks of resident gulls, petrels, gannets, and cormorants, as well as supporting countless seasonal migrants. Oceanic turtles, giant mantas, and cetaceans fed in the broad array of reefs and trenches, and the shoreline was home to several large colonies of subantarctic fur seal. With an ocean swelling with such bounty, it's no surprise then that the shoreline was patrolled by carnivores equipped to feast on this seafood buffet. Perhaps the first oddity one may encounter when making landfall on Skull Island was Parassodon, a unique and derived dromaeosaur that stood around 15 foot long and was designed for a piscivorous lifestyle. This elegant wader stalked the rocky strand line and sea stacks surrounding the island. Its long snout of sharp, straight, interlocking teeth revealed it as a fish-eater, much like the modern gharial. Whilst fish made up the bulk of its diet, it was not opposed to taking crabs, birds, and their eggs, and even an unguarded seal pup in the right circumstances. With a nictating membrane to keep stinging salt water from its eyes, and a long tail to keep it balanced on even the most uneven of rocks, Parassodon was equally at home in the still, swampy estuaries as it was in the surf-battered rocks. Modern evidence shows the feet of dromaeosaurs were excellently adapted to provide a strong grip, and whilst it's believed in many this was to anchor them to their prey, this function could serve just as well to anchor Parassodon to the craggy shores in rough wave periods. Another derived denizen of the turbid coasts was the lemursaur. Despite the name, they were actually derived amphibians, tough enough to survive in saltwater conditions. This is a trait not so far-fetched as one may believe, and several amphibians outside of Skull Island have adapted to this too. At a metre long, its squat, dense build and sturdy limbs equipped with sharp claws allowed it to serve as its own anchor as it grazed along the rocks like a marine iguana. Lemursaurs didn't forage for algae, however, instead using strong jaws and sharp teeth to prise mollusks and crustaceans straight off the rocks. These were often swallowed in entirety with minimal chewing, and the tough walls of its guts protected it from the jagged edges of its shelled prey. For shellfish connoisseurs like the lemursaur, they were spoiled for choice for both cosmopolitan and endemic species. One of these was Osteodomus, the Skull Island hermit crab. As well as shells and debris, larger individuals would often make good use of the fur seal skulls littering the coast. Scuticaris was a lobster from the Siluridae family, uniquely flattened to wedge itself into cracks in the rock to escape predatory octopi and lemursaurs alike. Cunea predator was the Skull Island land crab, with its ecology much the same as other terrestrial crabs like the colourful Christmas Island species, in that they typically lived inland. Only they had removed the need for annual mass spawnings, having evolved to skip the larval stage entirely. The mother kept her brood damp in a special cavity on her front until she found a sufficient bird's nest. Here she would deposit them to feed and grow on marine detritus and guano, until the offspring were large enough to join their parents at the jungle fringe. The steep cliffs were home to extensive bird colonies, and the lizards that fed upon them. The Skull Island monitor lizard was known as the dragon skin, and whilst both sexes had ornate patternings, this became a vibrant red in the males during the breeding season. These lithe varanids scrambled between cliff and shore, feasting on the seasonal treats of seabird eggs, well worth the climb to reach them, as well as eating smaller beachcombers hiding beneath the rocks. Discus was a descendant of Dracovolans, or the flying dragon. It could glide between cliffs and rocks on the sea breeze as it hunted for insects, and to avoid falling foul of the gulls that occasionally predated it. Despite its impressive gliding abilities, it was still relatively basal, compared to the true flying lizards further inland. Another unusual theropod adapted to a coastal lifestyle was Aciodactylus. This squat, stumpy dinosaur was a shellfish specialist. A compact jaw with thick, short teeth helped it crunch through the shells as it devoured them whole, and large splayed feet helped it to traverse the mud of the estuaries it called home. A bizarre adaptation it had was a secondary pair of nostrils on top of its head. Not only did these allow it to breathe with its head partially submerged, they also allowed it to trumpet air through them to communicate with others of its own kind. At between 12 and 15 foot long, Aciodactylus may look intimidating, but really it was described as a pretty placid animal. The bladed claws on its hands were waved and brandished at any aggressor that got too close, in an attempt to warn them away and avoid genuine conflict. Although sometimes it had to deal with genuine conflict whether it wanted to or not. Nefundosaurus was a brutish heavyweight and a beach bully. Its excellent sense of smell afforded by a large olfactory canal helped it to find food, dead or alive. and it was just as happy eating amphibians, smaller reptiles and humans as it was hoovering up decaying fish or other flotsam and jetsam. Its powerful jaws allowed it to crunch up turtle shells with ease, and a cast iron stomach full of powerful digestive acid churned up bone and shell alike. Nefundosaurus wasn't above theft either, and readily stole kills from the smaller Dirasuchus, a heavily derived species of Skull Island crocodile. These burly reptiles were actually more closely related to Nefundosaurus than the dinosaurs of the island, as Nefundosaurus was actually a pseudosuchian, with ancestors dating back to before the non-avian dinosaurs, and was quite possibly one of the Loricata. In some circumstances though, even the boorish Nefundosaurus had to remain cautious, especially in the presence of the true carrion king of the Skull Island coast, Tartarosaurus. With large individuals coming close to 30 foot long and being built like tanks, nothing on the Skull Island strand lines would stand in their way, except for another Tartarosaurus. These giant reptiles weren't shy when it came to combat, and the males had hooked talons on their front limbs to better rake and grapple with an opponent as they reared up to wrestle one another. Despite the ferocity of such matches with males battling for territory and resources, their resilient scales and rhinoceros-like hide usually prevented serious injury. Such conflicts were frequent, as Tartarosaurus was a nomad, following the scents of either mobile prey, fur seal colonies, or stranded marine life. With such rich but ephemeral resources, Tartarosaurus was adapted to make the most of things while the going was good. A large thick tail served as a fat store to build up in times of good hunting or a giant food source like a beached whale, and then used to keep the animal going in lean periods. For smaller animals unable to muscle in on large and unpredictable bounties, this fat store could often be a lifesaver. But Tartarosaurus was still an active hunter, and in a short sprint could outpace any man. This, combined with its aggression, appetite and shared foraging habitat with the native villagers, made it their terror, and it was feared easily as much and potentially more than Kong or any V-Rex. Fur seals, lemursaurs and any coastal reptile were all fair game for the coastal tyrant, and much like polar bears have been seen to do, it could even rear up to traverse cliff sides to inhale the eggs of various seabirds. It's not unreasonable for large carnivores to be present at coastlines. Dingoes on Fraser Island get a large chunk of their yearly food from semi-regular strandings, and whale carcasses can feed multiple packs for months. As a result of the rich oceanic resources and the constant flow of seafood, they're also some of the largest and healthiest dingoes there are. Brown hyenas are an even larger carnivore, and along the Namibian coastlines, populations of these shaggy scavengers are supported almost entirely by fur seal colonies. Through both the predation of pups and the scavenging of those dead, large carnivores can subsist entirely on beachcombing oceanic resources. The varied topography of the oceanic landscape, combined with the abyssal trench, is an ideal habitat to allow for diverse water masses, nutrient upwelling, and unique environments to support a vast marine ecosystem, with plenty of top-order foragers like assorted cetacean species. With such rich fisheries surrounding Skull Island, there was a constant flow of nutrients coming inland from the fur seal colonies, dead marine life, and beached cetaceans. In short, plenty to feed the large reptilian carnivores that patrolled the shores. Aciodactylus, Nefundosaurus, and Tartarosaurus all began life as original ideas for the animal that became Photodon. Aciodactylus was an early concept that was scrapped for being bipedal, along with another theropod, as it was felt they were too visually similar to the Venatosaurus and the V-Rex. This is also presumably why the Nefundosaurus was scrapped, due to its similarity to the V-Rex, albeit being quadrupedal. In the end, Jackson wanted something sprawling and lizard-like, and so the collection of squat, brutish carnivores became repurposed as the Coastal Guild of Beachcombing Reptiles on the Skull Island shores. The most threatened environment in Skull Island was its verdant lowlands. As the island shrank, they suffered more than any other ecosystem, and were believed to have lost about 80% of their area in just a few centuries. Threatened by the ever-encroaching rainforest on one side, or being flooded into a permanent marsh on the other, these gentle valleys represented the medium between the two. Fed by fresh springs and crisscrossed by winding rivers and oxbow lakes, it had plentiful water to feed the lush vegetation. The jungle itself was only kept back by the giant inhabitants of the lowlands. Here was home to the largest dinosaurs on the island. whose constant quest for food and territory continuously cleared the larger trees to create a tropical area of wet grassland and open scrub. Here life could bloom, from the titanic sauropods to the dense clouds of invertebrates that flew or scurried through grass as tall as a man. The largest inhabitant responsible for much of the clearing was Brontosaurus baxteri. At between 80 to 120 feet long, they outgrew any other denizen of Skull Island by an order of magnitude or several. On the outside, Brontosaurus may superficially resemble other sauropods, but on the inside it had a number of truly bizarre adaptations. For one, it had become viviparous, giving birth to up to 3 but typically only 1 young. As expected with this, it had also become K-selected. The young were cared for within the herd rather than being abandoned to the mercies of the environment. It suggested this was an adaptation to the constraint of island life, focusing more on the fewer offspring surviving due to reduced land and resources. The young were protected and socialized with all the herd, but the largest member was the dominant bull. Another curious adaptation was that with his harem, he didn't just include females, but males too. In Brontosaurus, dispersal was female biased, with them being the gender to move between herds for gene flow. The males that remained were reproductively suppressed by the bull, as he emitted hormones that prevented them ever reaching full maturity, and they rarely even approached the size of an adult cow. They represented a doomed surplus, and were effectively decoys for the breeding herd against V-Rex and other predators. This unusual social system may have come from the long lifespan of the Brontosaurus. In some animals with female-biased dispersal, it comes from the male tenure in the social unit exceeding the female age of first breeding. Due to the dominant bull effectively neutering his competition and having a very long lifespan, the females are instead the ones to move out to preserve genetic diversity in the species. Animals with female-biased dispersal also have very high proportions of unpaired males, and can also have a high male bias in their sex ratios too. This is likely what evolutionarily prompted the unique use of pheromones in the dominant bull. Such use has been speculated on in social mammals before evidence suggested it was actually stress and behavioural dominance that prevented subordinate breeding. So even out of their bizarre breeding, Brontosaurus are indeed a special case. Brontosaurus were also perhaps the most important ecological engineers on the island, and almost single-handedly kept the lowland areas open. The nomadic herds would move through the forest and flatten it as they went, leaving a broken mass of fertile biomass. Much like modern giraffes, Brontosaurus lived as treetop browsers, helping themselves to the area of vegetation out of access for any other herbivore on the island. They also created open paths through the trees for other animals to utilise, and their favoured food was the areas of new growth in young trees attempting to regrow on the grassland fringes. This is another way that Brontosaurus is unique. One may be tempted to draw parallels with elephants, but more recent research suggests that their more destructive influences on trees and woodlands is likely overstated, and works more in conjunction with several other factors, often with little direct effect. So whilst elephants may still negatively impact certain types of trees, Brontosaurus seem to be the only animals capable of creating such swift and rapid changes in forest landscapes. One thing they do have in common is that they can potentially provide food for smaller animals. Just as other herbivores have been seen to feed on elephants' smashed trees, the clearings created by Brontosaurus provide a woody banquet for other herbivores capable of processing the tough stems, as well as numerous leaves. With time, this wood decays as food for termites and invertebrates, which in turn feed the numerous insectivores too. With all these giant herbivores, it's no surprise that dung beetles were in abundance in the lowlands, and one endemic species was a typical brood borer. Following the great herds and the beetles that followed them was the white wedgehead, a unique lizard species that specialised in eating them. Following closely behind the Brontosaurus for the feast of fallen trees was Feructus. These impressive grazers took not only the lush grasses, but their powerful beaks allowed them to shear through shrubs, stems and cycads with ease. The Brontosaurus would go first to topple the trees, then the Feructus followed to act as the wood chippers and devour them. With smaller trees, they were also not above clearing them themselves. Strong shoulders and pointed nasal horns allowed them to uproot the most stubborn plants for food. With its close resemblance to Pachyrhinosaurus, Feructus is likely a centrosaurine ceratopsian. Whilst like with much of Skull Island's wildlife, it's puzzling as to how it got to the Skull Island landmass from the Americas. It could be that this diet of tough vegetation allowed it and its ancestors to survive. Some research shows that centrosaurines were better adapted to dealing with tougher plants with little stress than other ceratopsians. Phoructus then had 65 million years to continue improving on this too, resulting in one of the most enduring ceratopsians. Triceratops was the last large ceratopsian, and whilst it likely had a diet of at least some tough material and the adaptations to deal with it, it seemed to have eaten primarily soft angiosperms that may not have suited it to the forest and scrub of Skull Island. Whilst it's unknown what capacity the KT extinction impacted the reality of King Kong, it's possible a diet of tougher material like wood was one of the key things that allowed for survival in both extinction periods and glaciated periods too. Phoructus lived in nomadic herds, only becoming resident when eggs were laid. Breeding social groups consisted of 12 or so individuals, typically a dominant bull and his harem of females and their young. When accosted by a predator, the females would close around their young, and the bull would rush to confront the attacker. An adult bull Phoructus stood alongside Brontosaurus and Megapromatus Kong as the few island herbivores that could face off with an adult Vastatosaurus. Even the largest and hungriest V-Rex would think twice about tackling an enraged bull Phoructus. Even when not accosted by predators, the dominant bulls were intensely territorial. Anything that resembled either a threat or a challenger was attacked, and numerous expedition parties to Skull Island faced severe opposition by these belligerent titans that were easily as dangerous as any carnivore. Fights between males themselves were frequent, with the grand array of horns being primarily for dominant struggles between the bulls as they tried to defend or usurp their small herds of females. Usually a winner was clear early in the fight, with the loser beating a hasty retreat. Between a pair of evenly matched males though, things could get bloody. Severe injuries were common, and on the humid island even superficial wounds could turn into a fatal infection. For one bull to flat out kill another in the contest was also not unheard of. The younger bulls were not quite so laden with testosterone just yet, and once ousted from their natal herd, gathered instead in bachelor herds. As practice for the savage confrontations they'd one day have, bouts of playful sparring were a near daily occurrence, and a key form of socialization for the young bulls. This form of sexual segregation isn't uncommon in herbivores, and many species commonly form bachelor herds. In large and long-lived species, it may also serve a purpose other than just more eyes to spot predators though. It's possible that, like with elephants and giraffes, the older bulls fulfill the role of a teacher, the younger individuals in the herd learning from their behaviours. Older individuals could act as repositories of ecological knowledge for things like food, water, and predator defence that are important for the future leaders of their own harems. For the harems themselves, such organisations are also common among modern herbivores, but the one Phoructus most resembles is actually that of equids. In wild horses, they typically lived in small, semi-nomadic groups, and are aggressively defended from both alien males and predators by the stallion. In zebras, their anti-predator behaviour is also remarkably similar, with the females fleeing at a low speed, keeping their young in the middle, whilst the stallion attacks the predators viciously. In some cases, an aggressive assault from the stallion can even dissuade a hunt from taking place, as is the case with Phoructus. The large males are well built to repel attacks. They're almost half as large again as the females, and are more muscular. But the most noticeable aspects of their sexual dimorphism are their crests. Like earlier ceratopsians, the larger the frill, the more senior the animal was the rule on Skull Island too. Subadult males were almost indistinguishable from females, but for the mature males, frills and horns grew throughout their lives, with old bulls supporting incredibly impressive sets. The top horns could be over 6 foot long in some individuals. Despite this, it was the small horns in the centre of the frill that were the best indicator of age, and only the largest and oldest animals achieved a full crossover. The interesting build of Phoructus is quite derived from other ceratopsians, and is likely an adaptation to the increase of trees in its diet, and the increased need for power up front. Once this began to develop and also allowed males greater ability in combat, it swiftly led to an almost bison-like appearance. Immune as healthy adults may be to large predators, Phoructus of all age and sex couldn't escape parasites. Their iron hides were still vulnerable to biting dermal parasites, but they, along with other grassland species, had a solution. Skull Island had its own endemic termites, who build impressive castles of soil and clay much like other species. Not only did these provide great relief as scratching posts, the swarming soldier casts showed no mercy to the skin parasites whilst being too slight to damage the hides, performing a pest cleaning service for any of the giants nearby. Other reptiles were quite happy to utilise the termites too, but as food. Calcareosaurus was Skull Island's only ankylosaur, and surprisingly it was an insectivore. As well as digging through termite mounds, any large invertebrates in the scrub were eaten. Skull Island's guild of giant centipedes were particular favourites, and its thick hides made it impervious to their bites as it crunched them up whole. Bizarre as it may seem, an ankylosaur swapping the plants for protein isn't unheard of. The tiny Lioningosaurus not only bucked the trend of land life, but also very likely ate fish in its aquatic lifestyle. Calcareosaurus was well protected by its battery of spines, and was almost unmolested by Skull Island predators. The one exception was the cunning Venatosaurus, who was quite capable of tipping over the little tank for a helpless feast. Even more specialised was the bizarre Formicavero, often dubbed the Termitosaurus. Apparently descended from quadrupedal carnivores like Nefundosaurus or a Therapsid, it had diverged to feast on eusocial insects as a myrmecophage. With sturdy claws and canine teeth adapted into tusks, plus reduced incisors, these helped it tear into the castles of clay. Once the walls were breached, a long sticky tongue allowed it to plunder the nursery chambers for the fat-rich larvae. Whilst it could attempt to defend itself with brute force if necessary, a pair of garish dorsal fins attempted to dazzle any would-be attackers with aposematism. Young were hatched from eggs laid underground with no parental care. They hatched as perfect miniatures, ready to take on the world as terrorizers of the invertebrate fauna of Skull Island. The most numerous large herbivore on Skull Island was Ligocristus. The surviving hadrosaur of the Mesozoic, they bloomed on Skull Island in herds of several dozen individuals. At between 25 and 35 feet long, they weren't especially well armed, and instead relied on sharp senses to flee. Their long-legged, gracile builds and broad feet allowed them a good turn of speed, as well as the ability to take to water to avoid threats. Dappled markings also helped them blend in as they traversed the forests too. But above all else, Ligocristus relied on vigilance to protect themselves. Their large herds and loud alarm calls made ambush difficult, just as their sharp eyes that could swivel in their sockets did too. Adaptability was the key to Ligocristus' success on the island, and they were able to eat almost any plant matter. Grasses, leaves, water plants, roots and bark were all plucked by their beaks and mashed up in the batteries of grinding teeth. There has been debate over hadrosaur feeding, with arguments made for both browsing and grazing. Some new evidence shows that no matter which of the two dominated hadrosaur diet, it may have been more diverse than first thought. Fossilized dung known as coprolites shows evidence that hadrosaurs likely ate decaying wood. Whilst not especially nutritious, if laden with fungi and invertebrates that feast on decaying wood, it could serve as a reasonable stew of assorted types of biomass to feed a dinosaur. Some evidence also shows that they consumed types of crustacean that also made their home in rotting trees, a good source of extra protein and minerals. Perhaps similar to Feructus, it's the variety in the diet and ability to consume resources like decaying trees that allowed Ligocristus' hadrosaur ancestor to survive another 65 million years. In the breeding season, males could flush the crest to give a deep vermilion hue to signal dominance and sexual availability. This was the first part of the Ligocristus lex. As has been speculated for hadrosaurs and especially Parasaurolophus, the crest allowed for auditory communication. Herds would trumpet to remain in contact in thick trees, rumble to signal food patches, and grunt to display mood or dominance. For the breeding males gathered together, deafening mating calls accompanied the flashing crests. When combined with the dust kicked up from the performance scratches, and the posturing of large numbers of huge dinosaurs, an active lek must have been an astonishing spectacle, and for the predators, a dinner bell. Cunning hunters were quick to take advantage of exhausted competitors on the sidelines of the event, and trim down the herd. Once the mating had commenced though, some Ligocristus had a trick up its sleeve to thwart the numerous predators and egg thieves of the mainland. Many mothers would choose to nest on small islets, and the sandbars that emerged in the drier months. Few Skull Island predators were inclined to swim, and the aquatic carnivores rarely left the water. The eggs hatched in synchronized batches, and their high-pitched calls drew the mothers back to care for the young until they were old enough to find their feet for the return journey. This is where the flaw in this plan came. The short swim across a river or marsh for an adult was easy, but fraught with mortal peril for the chicks. Several species of aquatic carnivore waited for this yearly buffet, and Inox was one of them. The common name for Inoculopilus edax, it had remained almost unchanged from its Permian ancestor Diplocaulus, only growing meatier limbs and tails for more aggressive ambush predation. They chiefly preferred weed-choked marshes or stagnant ponds for camouflage, where they readily hunted anything they could fit into their mouth. These waterways also hosted their tadpoles, which were much the same as baby newts or salamanders, only getting their signature arrowhead with maturity. Eudosaurs would also show up for this hatchling gauntlet, a compact bullet-headed reptilian carnivore. Whilst they normally hunted fish in packs of half a dozen, herding them into bait balls they could pluck at from will, they were also quite happy to snatch Lygocristus chicks on their first migration. Most of the giant herbivores of Skull Island had relatively few redesigns compared to some of the other dinosaurs. The Brontosaurus is said to be the only animal unchanged from the original 1996 script, from which a sketch also exists of a traditional Triceratops that presumably became Feructus. With the dearth of other bulky ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, it can be assumed that the designs for Feructus and Lygocristus were settled early on. It also seems possible that Lygocristus was originally slated to play a larger role. It had a full-sized maquette created for a full CGI model, seemingly a bit much for an animal that only appears in the film as a corpse. With so many large herbivores, it's no surprise there was a large carnivore to hunt them. On Skull Island, that was Vastatosaurus rex, the Ravager lizard king. At between 40 and 50 foot long, it was the largest predator on the island by far, and a direct descendant of Tyrannosaurus. In the 65 million years, a suite of noticeable changes had occurred. The shape of the head had changed, and the snout had become buttressed with a ridge of bone. This being more prevalent in bulls suggests that it played a role in combat for territory. Every adult V-Rex bore a tapestry across its face, crisscrossed with scars, calluses and growths from hunts, kills, fights and mates in their violent lifestyles. The forelimbs were marginally larger and also had an extra finger, to assist in pinning kills to the body for more efficient movement of its food. V-Rex also had noticeably more compact torsos, with far fewer ribs than Tyrannosaurus and greatly reduced gastralia too. Whilst this allowed the V-Rex great mobility, it's possible this adaptation could have less beneficial origins. Skeletal defects in animals suffering severe inbreeding depression are frequent, and one of the most common is those of the lumbar spine and ribs, often having abnormal numbers of them. The tucked waist of the V-Rex may have its roots in aberrant mutation. It's possible this could also explain the overlapping teeth in some individuals too, as this is hardly beneficial to the animal and is also another frequent key indicator of severe inbreeding. Finally, it's worth noting that this was actually the intention behind the trio of the V-Rex scene in the film. Artist Greg Broadmoor compared them to bad-tempered hillbillies, and literally describes them being envisioned as inbred dinosaurs. With both the Katy extinction and numerous other sweeping changes in the Earth's climate in the 65 million years following it, it's not unlikely that these tyrannosaurs had the occasional genetic bottleneck, and relatively poor genetic diversity too. But some of the mutations may have given them possible benefits for the unique Skull Island ecosystem. Adaptations can often come from mutations after all, even if said benefits may be short-term compared to the increasing health deficits inbreeding depression may eventually bring. Whatever genetic inadequacies they may have had, V-Rex were still capable breeders. The females entered as far into the forest as their bulk allowed, to lay their eggs in a giant mound of warm, rotting vegetation, the perfect incubator. The female V-Rex didn't tend to her clutch, but did periodically urinate on the mound. The pungent musk delivered was typically sufficient to keep most other predators away. All except the stealthy Adlapsosaurus. For this bizarre nest raider, the scent of V-Rex urine was like Christmas dinner. Even the Ravager lizard king wasn't off the menu for this thief, and the huge eggs were a feast worth the risk when it had hauled them back to its den after a successful sortie. Eggs of any kind were eaten, and if not available, the chicks would do just fine as well. When finally hatched, baby V-Rex were noticeably different from their parents. With their proportionally longer limbs and lighter build, they were built for speed and agility, and with their barred coloration, they were superb jungle hunters. Until adulthood, the siblings would stick together, starting off with lizards and centipedes as their primary fare before gradually taking larger prey with their growing bulk. This division between the adults and the young is often known as ontogenetic niche shift, or ontogenetic niche partitioning. It's effectively the juveniles eating different things in different areas to reduce competition with the adults, and is well represented in modern reptiles like crocodilians and monitor lizards. It's also believed to be an ecological strategy used by Tyrannosaurus, where like the little V-Rex, young T-Rex were fast and agile, as well as being unable to crush bone like their heavyweight parents, who utilised a different and larger set of prey. It's also possible this helped the Tyrannosaurs squeeze out competition too, with T-Rex's one-sided dominance of predator guilds. Whilst V-Rex still had a lot of smaller competitors to deal with as young, this strategy has clearly still served them well for millennia. As well as hunting, young V-Rex weren't afraid to bully other carnivores off their kills once they'd reached the stage of juveniles. With some other jungle predators though, this could backfire severely. When accosting a pack of Venatosaurus over a kill, the social dromaeosaurs were averse to serious conflict, instead using subtle posturing and warning hunts to diffuse conflict and downregulate aggression. All this would be lost on the V-Rex young, and conflict was inevitable. With a classic overconfidence of youth, V-Rex subadults rarely picked their battles well, and won them against Venatosaurus rarer still. What was common was a V-Rex to get its first set of lasting scars from the pack hunters, and those were the lucky ones. A good handful didn't survive these skirmishes. Worst still would be if these juvenile delinquents found a Venatosaurus nest. Ignorant to the alarm calls of the babysitter, the V-Rex would attempt to bully it off the nest. Food was one thing, but when defending their young, Venatosaurus showed no mercy, and the rest of the pack would arrive to exert lethal aggression on the young Tyrannosaurs. Caution and cunning were every bit as vital in the jungle as brute strength for these growing subadults. Once large enough, the survivors would graduate to young adulthood, and move to the more open areas frequented by their parents. Here there was some spatial partitioning between the adults too. Females preferred the forest edges where they could explore for future nesting sites and tend to the current ones. With no such commitments, the adult bulls preferred the most open territories where they could swing their weight around. Despite this partitioning, V-Rex was still fiercely territorial. A dawn chorus reinforced their position and claims to the territory, and waste was expelled along borders to demarcate the boundaries. The smell of such markings and the sound of a roar could tell V-Rex much about the physical condition of that territory's owner. As such, conflict was minimised, and in the event of two evenly matched V-Rex meeting, it was typically settled with a dispute of who had the loudest roar. In the event of neither backing down, serious fights could erupt. No matter who won, both contestants were getting a fresh set of scars from such showdowns. The obvious exception to this came in the breeding season, when males ventured into the territories of receptive females. The two would hunt, mate and rest together for a bout of several days before she sent him on his way. Young adults would occasionally shadow mature territorial individuals, learning behaviours from a distance and stealing a free meal from an unguarded carcass wherever possible. Bold youngsters may even attempt to move into a bull's undefended territory in a mating bout too, though his success in keeping it wasn't likely. V-Rex were happy to hunt or scavenge, whichever was most convenient. An intensely acidic stomach allowed it to digest even the most rotten of meat. Huge jaws allowed it to shatter bone, and its huge size meant it could bully anything smaller off a carcass. It was still a capable predator though, and like any respectable tyrannosaur, its main diet was hadrosaurs, with Lygocristus making up the bulk of its prey. If a female or vulnerable Feroctus or Brontosaurus could be brought down, this was ideal, but the defense of the aggressive males often made this a risky choice. Anything smaller was a potential meal, but smaller and swifter prey were typically left to the juveniles who actually had hope of catching them. Like their ancient descendants, V-Rex were ambush predators, often lying in wait in the shade of the forests bordering the lowlands, the cover of ruins or beside a waterhole before making a lunge for an oblivious herd member. Despite the dozens of designs and redesigns it went through, the V-Rex is perhaps the least removed from the animal it was conceived from, the Tyrannosaurus. As well as the typical Hollywood demands of bigger and badder, it was also given crocodilian-like scales for the vintage factor of old paleo art. The three seen in the movie were also given distinct roles of a young male, a bull in its prime, and an old matriarch, and were designed accordingly with their mass, posture, and proportions to reflect this. As with any top predator, V-Rex had its fair share of camp followers. One of the most unique was Lycaosaurus. An intelligent and social synapsid, they were cunning and opportunistic hunters. Packs were nuclear families, a pair that mated for life with their adult offspring. At 6 foot long, they were on the small side for Skull Island. but made up for it with agility, numbers, and intelligence. They would often trail V-Rex, waiting for either a large kill to scavenge from or to launch their own hunt in the chaos of the theropod's attack, isolating a young, sick, or weakling in the chaos. For these cunning predators, anything was on the menu. They were much like the spotted hyenas of Skull Island. Cunning, opportunism, and pack hunting allowed them to take down nearly anything, and they weren't above following other carnivores directly to steal their kills or benefit from their hunts. Similar to them as well, their pups were most often twins, being born in a dugout den lined with dry vegetation. As well as meat, Lycaosaurus were fond of eggs. An ideal source of this was the massive flightless birds of Skull Island. Zoropteryx was 6 foot at the hip and could swing its bladed beak like an axe. But even it seemed gracile compared to the burly Brutornis. Standing a foot taller and even heavier built, it was the largest avian on Skull Island. Its powerful legs allowed it to run down smaller prey, to be killed with a strike of its huge and heavy bill. The birds nested on the edges of thick grass, concealing their nest in dense vegetation, but able to look out over the open areas for incoming threats. The precocious chicks had unique plumage to camouflage them in the grass as they followed their giant mother. The melon-sized eggs were irresistible to Lycaosaurus, and mated pairs would conduct cunning raids to acquire them. One would conspicuously approach to draw the mother's attention, and then lure her away to allow the other to raid the nest. This was a risky strategy. Lead too far and the mother would return to the nest. Too close and she would catch one of them. Brutornis didn't eat for almost a month guarding their clutch, and a whole Lycaosaurus would be a welcome treat. Flightless birds are a staple of prehistoric adventure, and in the extended edition the crew of the USS Venture accidentally kill a young Brutornis, which was also the only fully animatronic creature in the film, another also later being shot by one of the first missions by Project Legacy. There were plenty of true scavengers though, and the Lowlands especially had a booming scavenger guild. An animal that didn't die of a violent death swiftly became an absolute scrum of activity, and plenty of these were endemic insects. The scissor beetle was a flightless scavenger that hopped to carcasses on grasshopper-like legs to shear off chunks of meat with its impressive jaws. Hairy maggot flies rushed madly between the carcasses, keen to deposit the squirming masses of their young that fed on the larvae of other insects. Any that failed to find a carcass in time were eaten themselves. The Skull Island meat weevil laid its eggs deep in the muscle tissue, allowing its young to pass through the guts of other scavengers to emerge as larvae in their dung. 2-foot-long carrion centipedes rushed back and forth from kills, stealing and burying the meat. Worst of all was the ornate carrion beetle. Their bright colours warned of others arriving for a feast, of the noxious chemicals they could produce from their shells. Even a V-Rex would abandon a carcass if they showed up. Vertebrate scavengers persisted too. The Skull Island great grey agama would readily feast on a new kill, as would any photodon. Oddest of all were perhaps the carrion parrots. The green, red, fiery and great species had kept the strong beaks and inquisitive nature of their ancestors. A normal parrot's diet of fruit often drives them to mineral licks to eat clay, and for their bones and beaks the intelligent birds also often need a source of calcium. And surprisingly, modern parrots will actually eat meat as well, so this really isn't that surprising. Maybe ancestors that ate the rich resource of dinosaur bones for the mineral content began to consume more and more flesh, until they'd adapted for this energy-laden resource to become their chief source of food. More typical avian scavengers were the carrion storks. The larger of the two, Prophanornis spinosus, stood 6 foot at the hip, and lived a lot of its life as a typical wader, feasting on fish and amphibians. When carrion was available though, it would quite readily dig in. The smaller Sordicus was an active hunter of anything smaller than itself, even its own kind or non-avian dinosaur chicks. For when a new corpse was found, it had an extendable crop to bulk feed on the ephemeral resource of carrion too. These storks are likely descended from large Asian species like the greater adjutant, the Indian equivalent of the better-known marabou, but one that shares its generalist diet and occasional taste for carrion. The night skies above the open lowlands brought in a whole new cast of winged animals. The flying rodents. Voluceratus was one of them, a flying rat-like animal that hunted with superb night vision over sound. They were savagely territorial, and singletons or mated animals fought hard for territory, sometimes even to the death. They also didn't go quietly if accosted by a predator too. And one such predator were the pug bats. Actually flying synapsids, they were unpleasant nocturnal pack hunters. Living in groups of up to 15 adults and young, they hunted by flying between sleeping herbivores, spooking them with eerie calls. In the panic, the packs would descend on the small, sick, or weak, gnawing on the soft skin of the throat or stomach to overwhelm the victim with either blood loss or the virulent bacteria that run rampant in their mouths. There was plenty to fear on land too for baby dinosaurs. The moon spider was an 8-inch nocturnal hunter that ate just about anything it could, but it was often drawn to the scent of hatching dinosaur chicks. Despite its name, the moon spider wasn't a true spider, but a solifuge. Often known as camel spiders or sun spiders, moon spider is likely a pun on their nocturnal behaviour. The moon spider is also unique in the family in that it developed paralytic venom, powerful enough to cause discomfort to even an adult dinosaur. Modern mainland solifuges simply rely on their savage chelicerae to open up and kill their prey instead. Water was the lifeblood of the island, and being close to the equator, Skull Island had plentiful rainfall for much of the year to support its incredible plant life. Not all of this was sucked up by thirsty roots, and the island was crisscrossed by numerous rivers and streams. Ponds and pools were frequent features of the landscape, and near the centre of the island was a gigantic marsh. The waters here ranged from knee-deep shallows to tannin-steeped channels of murky water that could submerge a brontosaurus. And all of the depths were teeming with unique biota on every trophic level. Perhaps the most common resident herbivores in the Skull Island wetlands were Malamagnus. Large herd-dwelling herbivores, they lived and browsed in channels deep enough to submerge them, and weren't picky about where they fed. Reeds and lilies were consumed just as readily as any land vegetation, and the herd would meander between both in their journeys up and down the waterways. At only 20 foot long, they were still vulnerable to larger predators on land, and would retreat crashing back into the water if attacked. Smaller threats could be confronted head-on. All members of the adult herd were equipped with huge jaws and tusk-like teeth, and confronted both smaller predators and rival herds aggressively. They became especially intolerant in the breeding season, with the males regularly fighting and the whole herd becoming a lot more protective over its territory. Large rubbery eggs were laid close to the water, and the young hatched well developed and grew quickly in their first year, to better repel all sizes of aquatic predator. There's no denying Malamagnus strongly resemble hippopotamus, and have quite similar ecology too. Both species disperse huge amounts of nutrients into the water with their dung, that feeds masses of fish and invertebrate life. On Skull Island, there's even a species known as the dirt turtle, that feeds primarily on Malamagnus dung. Hippos' relationships with their own waterways are more complex, and whilst useful providers of nutrients in the wet season, they can also cause eutrophication in the dry season, and stagnate the still pools to reduce biodiversity. However, the high rainfall of Skull Island and the relatively minor impact of the dry season may prevent a similar build-up of suffocating nutrients, and so make Malamagnus an important subsidizer of resources with little negative impact. Hippos also change the environments they live in physically too, and their movements in and out of the water create channels and change water flow in and out of wetland areas. As well as changing water flow, they can fill lakes and alter sediment composition with knock-on effects. It's not unreasonable to consider them ecosystem engineers, and Malamagnus too for their parallel ecology creating their own channels and altering the Skull Island flows in their own way. So whilst the mighty Pteranodon may be the waterway's queen, Malamagnus is its architect. The queen herself was picky about where they would swim, as despite Pteranodon's huge battery of gills, they didn't like to hunt in silty water. With the massive size of females, they hunted primarily in ambush on steep-banked river sides. Like some catfish and other species, Pteranodon was equipped with barbels on its lower mandible. These have some ability as tactile organs that had been heightened greatly in Pteranodon with their enlarged size, and it would rest these on the river floor to detect the footfalls of animals coming down to drink. When a suitable target was close enough, it would launch itself with a sweep of its giant tail to seize the prey. Small animals were killed outright by the bite. Larger ones dragged into the depths and drowned. Pteranodon had a double-hinged jaw, able to pivot in two places to swallow large prey whole. Whilst primarily a crocodile-like ambush hunter, it wasn't opposed to hoovering up small snacks if they had made the mistake of entering water bodies. Pteranodon's sight was relatively poor, and it rarely hunted with vision other than detecting the shadows of prey above it. Animals on the river floor or close to it were often relatively safe and much harder to detect. Pteranodon swam with a movement type known as anguilliform, undulating almost all of the body from side to side. This isn't especially fast, but Pteranodon didn't need to be in its role as an ambush predator. Its flexible neck allowed it great mobility, and it could steer well with its paddle-like pectoral fins. Much like a lot of Skull Island's terrestrial predators, flexibility was the greater attribute over straight-line speed. Giant trees dotted through the water and winding channels meant a sprint was unlikely. For the females, anyway. Male Pteranodon were far smaller. A big female Pteranodon could reach over 50 feet, the largest males were lucky if they ever got to 20. The giant females selected the males by not selecting them, making no effort to accommodate their advances as she weaved through the rivers and marshes. Only the strongest and fastest males could actually keep up, and thus the best would eventually get the chance to mate. Once mating had occurred, Pteranodon had live young. Born at 5 foot long in groups of a dozen, they were purely precocious, and quickly took to their role as predators. Living in the shadows, they performed like miniature adults, hunting waterfowl and dinosaur chicks until they were large enough to handle adult specimens. Juvenile Photodon were a common prey too, and often snapped up as they floated on the surface in their nursery groups. Like many top-order carnivores, Pteranodon were covered in parasites. Consuming so many other animals often means taking on their loads as well, and many forget just how many pathogens and parasites predators play host to. Estrivermis was a 20-each worm with a mouthpart like a drill. It rasped its way through the thick hide and tissue below until it found a blood vessel, and stayed there. Its body trailed behind it like a streamer, leaking its waste and eggs into the water as it was dragged along. Profanus was even larger, a free-swimming tapeworm that gnawed its way into the flesh to both feed and breed on it, laying its larvae into the wound until they were old enough to detach and repeat the grisly process with their own hosts. Contorio bestiola were arthropods that swam freely in the still fresh water until swallowed. There they would attach to the stomach lining and would then pupate into adulthood and roam the gut freely. They lived on food swallowed by the host, and would multiply until they infested the entire gastrointestinal tract, often to great discomfort and malnourishment to the host. Cuticidus, the skin crab, burrowed into the skin and fed from the wound, its carapace growing around it as it did to make it harder to shrug off. It detached only to breed and would quickly find a new host after. But Pteranodon had a trick up its sleeve to relieve itself of all these unwelcome guests. Every so often, Pteranodon would beach itself. Several bird species recognized this behavior, as did 2 species of lizard, and would flock quickly to the beached giants for a time-limited feast. Pteranodon would remain stationary as its helpers pulled free the now useless and immobile parasites, and considering their great size they made for a good meal. Any food caught between the leviathan's teeth were also fair game. And whilst the old stories of plovers and crocodiles having this relationship are just that, stories, a similar symbiosis exists with species of reef fish. Cleanoras are famous for their services in removing parasites, and studies also show that reinfection rates are very high, making this a reasonable feeding strategy. If it's the same for Pteranodon, then semi-regularly visiting the same spot may make it a reliable source of food for several species. Pteranodon only had a short amount of time on land before heat and suffocation forced it back into the water, although on rare occasions it may also beach itself to hunt. Such behaviour is occasionally seen in animals like orcas, where it's a learned behaviour from other individuals only in certain groups. With no such teaching going on in Pteranodon, the behaviour only stood as a monument to their tenacity as predators. Pteranodon started with several very different concepts, including a typical pliosaur and a stonefish-mouthed quadruped. One of these was a serpentine swimmer with a mouth like a Dunkleosteus, that ultimately wound up being refined into the similar and more fish-like final design, which was partly inspired in the face from a deep-sea anglerfish. Much like Melamagnus, Pteranodon also occasionally fed the detritivores, albeit with the remnants of occasional kills that drifted down to the floor of the waterways. Numerous crabs had evolved specially to take advantage of this resource. Empuricaris and Funicaris were both specialised scavengers of the freshwater benthos. Similar to deep-sea boneworms, there was also Incytulpus, the squalor limpet, that had a unique enzyme that allowed it to soften bone to rasp away at. The waterways were a battleground of invertebrates. Endemic water boatmen, diving beetles and pond skaters all clashed in a tiny arms race in the ponds and lakes. It's also no surprise that Skull Island had its own unique mosquito species too. that plagued the herds of dinosaurs and especially the Ligocristus as they ferried their young across from their island nurseries. Not all invertebrates were tiny though. Some millennia ago, a group of centipedes diverged from the rest of their family to become aquatic, and became a new group all on their own that was dubbed the Neopedes. The most prevalent on Skull Island was the Scorpiopede. Colonies of these large invertebrates thrived wherever there was a good water source flanked by their favourite crop, algae. It was gnawed from logs, rocks, and tree trunks with their shear-like mouthparts and forelimbs as the groups roved along the shorelines. The larvae, though, were predatory swimmers, with eggs laid on leaves or under branches. They had no legs, and it took 3 years of a high-protein diet and numerous molts for them to grow them and reach adult size. Scorpiopedes were very territorial, and reacted with hostility to anything that came too close, or they perceived as intruding on their food source. The group that attacked the crew of the Venture in 1933 may have been more interested in eating the rafts than the men on them, or viewed the company as an obstacle in the way of their food. The venom they possessed was lethal to small animals, but only caused discomfort to large ones. On the other end of the spectrum was Hydrocemex maximus, a 12-foot aquatic monster. Its venom wasn't as strong as other species, so it injected it by the bucketful to take down juvenile dinosaurs. Mortophylex venefucus was less of a swimmer, and instead used lure and ambush. It waggled its fish-like bait near the surface to attract any prey, be it bird, fish or reptile, into getting too close and to be struck with a fast-acting nerve poison. Specialized legs near its head were adapted to grab and hold during capture and feeding. Aspersimex exos was a swift and active predator that pursued fish in small streams. At only a foot long, it had become superbly adapted to the aquatic lifestyle, and had shed its limbs in favour of a flat tail for better propulsion. Nepalacus had something similar, with intricate webbing around its body supported by its remaining limbs for efficient swimming. Nephocosus was often mistaken for a neopede, but was in fact a cephalochordate, from the same family as hagfish and lampreys. It hunted small prey in the murky gloom, relying on a basic lateral line to home in on their movements. Another member of the same family was the unpleasant killer eel. Whilst not especially dangerous singly, where they'd only eat small fish or similar-sized animals, the danger came in a group. When coming across something sick or injured, they would begin to rasp chunks from its body with their sharp teeth, and when blood was in the water, they would swarm. Killer eels could live in groups of up to 100, and when attacking prey too slow to get away en masse, they could reduce it to bone in mere minutes. Luckily, the eels were lethargic swimmers, and not very quick either. Strong swimmers in good condition were typically able to avoid them. The eggs were laid in sticky masses in water vegetation, with very few making it to adulthood due to just about everything eating them. A short lifespan also prevented their numbers from getting too unruly as well. Killer eels were also very sensitive, and any change in temperature or acidity would cause great die-offs of them. When not being harassed by the killer eels, Skull Island had its own diverse array of unique fish. As well as herbivores, detritivores and generalists, there was a handful of predators living in Pteranodon's shadow. Sepulchro and Papilio were brutish bottom dwellers, lying in the silt of the river floors and waiting for the prey to come to them. With gigantic mouths, they preferred schools of small fish that they could engulf in a single sweep. If not, large prey was always an option with such a massive gape, and they could swallow animals approaching their own size. More active was the needlemouth, a gar-like hunter of flowing water. At only a fifth or so of Pteranodon size, it could afford speed, and often chased its prey in straight sprints down the waterways. If there was one animal that didn't have to worry about any of these, it was the stinkfish. Slow, sluggish herbivores, when harassed they could produce an inky, nauseating cloud of chemicals and waste that adhered to the skin of predators. One encounter was all it took for any predator to get a lifetime lesson in leaving stinkfish alone. A peculiar resident of the wetlands was the swamp wing. Unlike the webbed feet of real-life flying frogs, the swamp wing had formed bizarre bat-like wings. Despite this, they were nowhere near as accomplished flyers, and could only manage a barely controlled glide for short distances. This poor excuse for flight also came at the cost of their swimming ability, and once fully mature, adults avoided submerging themselves except to breed. Swamp-wing tadpoles looked much like any other young anuran, and were mature at 15 weeks. The curious amphibians lived on rafts of vegetation or the numerous trees in the wetlands, and it's possible this explains their poor efforts of becoming volant. They also had to hunt on terra firma too, as their flight was too poor to allow for hunting on the wing. This is also reminiscent of perhaps the strongest theory of how the first flight developed in early birds, that they were arboreal theropods that first learned to glide between trees to avoid a dangerous trip to the forest floor. Gliding became shaky wing beats, and eventually the true form of powered flight evolved. Swamp wings just substituted the forest floor for a channel full of predators. That said, things would likely never improve for the swamp wings as ectothermic frogs. They would never attain the respiratory and metabolic rates for powered flights, and were likely stuck as an evolutionary dead end even if the island hadn't sank. Like many waterways, Skull Island was home to assorted species of turtle. It had its own species of snapping turtle, every bit as predatory and belligerent as its distant American relatives. Loggerhead turtles also roamed the waterways, but bizarrely this wasn't even a subspecies but the normal oceanic one. With no speciation, they seemed a relatively recent addition to the island, and it's unknown what drew them to the unnatural home of fresh water. But safety wasn't one of the variables. Turtocassis was a relative of the eudosaur, an aquatic carnivore with a taste for anything that lived in a shell. Its long tubular head allowed it to tear the heads and flippers off its prey, and plunge deep inside to pick the innards clean. Like many waterway predators, it wasn't fast, replacing speed with a sinuous build to squeeze between branch-choked channels and deep rivers in pursuit of prey. The shallows of the waterways were often considerably safer, and home to the wading guild of Skull Island. Dinosaurs, avian and non-avian, patrolled the shallows and reed beds for a variety of different prey. Falcotops was a theropod that fed primarily on the carrion whelk and other mollusks. Its unusual scythe-like bill allowed it to peel the flesh out of the mini-fortresses to be swallowed whole, similar to the African openbill, another shellfish-specialized dinosaur. The Fursodactylus replaced the jacana, being a tiny theropod so light it could traverse the lilies. Storks, egrets and spoonbills were common in these gentle pools, and a great many species here could be found in other parts of Asia or the rest of the world too. Skull Island still had a few endemics though, the Skull Island subspecies of cattle egret and the great grey heron. Not only did the latter eat fish, it also occasionally speared the young photodon that called the shallows home too. Once they reached the juvenile stage though, the tables would be turned. A close relative of the coastal Parassodon also lived here, Ambulaquasaurus. It preferred the shaded edges of waterways where glare was reduced, and could strike at fish with pinpoint accuracy. 14 foot long and the burliest of the wading theropods, it had the stability necessary to wade even thigh-deep into fast-flowing rivers. Much like grizzly bears waiting for the salmon run, Skull Island had its own equivalent. The island mullet species, known locally as sparklesides, made yearly migrations up the rivers to spawn in inland pools. The Ambulaquasaurus would be ready and waiting in position, at waterfalls and stream points for this seasonal feast. Axiciocephalus may appear much like any other of the reptilian waders on the outside, but dissection and study revealed it as actually the last surviving pterosaur on the planet. It appeared to hunt like a heron, wading through streams to pluck fish out with its mesh of teeth, and whilst it did often use this tactic, it would occasionally submerge to hunt like the dipper family, pulling itself along the stony riverbeds with its hind limbs as it foraged for bottom-dwelling fish and invertebrates. Pterosaurs were a more diverse family than many can often realise. Some, like the Asdarchids, seem to have been terrestrial stalkers, hunting for prey on the ground like a stork or a ground hornbill. Others, like Pterodaustro, lived as sweep feeders in nutrient-rich lagoons, foraging at night as they bobbed along the surface. With such behavioural variation already present in the family, and with 65 million years of evolution to work with, maybe the scissor-headed pterosaur isn't quite so outlandish, even if it remained a curiosity on an island already full of curiosities. Much of Skull Island was now covered in thick rainforest. There was perhaps some of the most pristine and impressive in the known world. Trees as tall as skyscrapers served as ecosystems all on their own, whereas below them the smaller undergrowth engaged in competition every bit as intense of that of the animal residents for the avenues of light let in by the giants. All of this was connected by highways of vines and creepers so extensive they could keep a dead tree standing for years. Such extensive forests let little light down to the forest floor, which was a world of fungi and mosses that grew to huge sizes on the pulsing nutrients of a meters deep leaf litter. Its inhabitants were a bizarre mix of prehistoric refugees and derived adaptations. and in the hot, wet dark of this green bower the reptiles flourished. The most common predator of the jungles was Venatosaurus. Heavily derived dromaeosaurs, they were bizarre, unique, and lethal. The most striking change from their ancient family was the lack of feathers. The exact reason for the baldness was unknown, but it's possible a mix of their large size and high energy lifestyle, with swift cursorial chases in such a hot, humid environment, meant that a thick coat of feathers hampered efficient thermoregulation. Their now featherless hands had evolved wrists that could swivel and supinate, as well as incredibly dexterous fingers. No longer as important for communication and balance, their hands had become grasping tools, with great mobility and ability to manipulate. Venatosaurus would often use their dexterous hands to move cover for better vision during stalks, or to forage for small prey or heave over armoured animals. Their eyes had moved further up their head to better peer over cover, as well as to help see above them. Not only was this important in a brontosaurus hunt when weaving between the panicked titans, it was also useful in jungle runs to keep an eye on potential predators like carvers that could strike from above, or the huge dangling spiders or centipedes. Adult Venatosaurus were too large to be a real prey item for them, but in the humid forests a venomous bite could quickly become a lethal infection. For both low-light hunts beneath thick canopies and nocturnal raids, Venatosaurus had excellent night vision. The rib cage of these dinosaurs had shortened but deepened, and when combined with their mobile hips allowed the dromaeosaurs a great deal of flexibility for winding hunts in the labyrinthine jungles, but with no cost in lung capacity. What was reduced was top speed, but it could be argued this was a less important trait in such thick environments. One aspect of Venatosaurus that's near impossible to compare with their ancestors is intelligence. But with millennia of evolution, the dromaeosaurs had woven numerous tactics in their hunting strategy comparable to those of modern mammals. Venatosaurus would often herd their prey into tight corridors formed by the ruins left by the islanders, with more Venatosaurus often lying in wait to pick up the chase. Knowledge of their territory allowed them to outrun and outflank their prey between the trees and buildings, strategically revealing themselves to flush them down certain routes with either dead ends, cliffs, or broken terrain to injure or kill their targets. As well as being a successful strategy against very swift prey like Silverceratops, it also allowed them to hunt the largest denizens of Skull Island, the Brontosaurus. By using tactics and cognition, they were able to bring down far larger prey than the brute force of the V-Rex could ever achieve, and they were the only species to regularly hunt healthy adults. Venatosaurus would hunt anything within reason, and their menu and tactics were often decided by the territory they lived in. Packs within territory bordering on the more open lowlands became nocturnal, so as to avoid the risk of predation or kleptoparasitism with the mighty V-Rex. Their excellent night vision was also far superior to that of the herbivores, and daring raids could be conducted on herds of Feructus unable to coordinate themselves into a defensive system, or on Ligocristus too blind to flee. Whilst some are often skeptical of the hunting tactics of various animals, and often assume it's just chance and luck, there's solid evidence that shows genuine strategy. African painted wolves are repeatedly observed flushing their prey into the fences of reserves to increase their hunting success and take down larger prey. This is applying a behaviour other packs in non-fenced areas will use, of chasing their prey into thick vegetation to slow it down for the kill, to novel human infrastructure, just as the Venatosaurus used the ruins. The notion of flanking and driving the prey into other waiting individuals also isn't unique to Skull Island. In the sparse cover of Etosha National Park, detailed research shows lion hunts aren't just a charge at random. But in the desert at least, the individual lions have specific roles they take in the hunt, primarily wings and centres. The lionesses appear aware of the other individuals and their roles in the hunt, moving themselves to better organise successful ambushes with their pridemates. Wings and centres function much as you'd expect, with wings flushing prey towards the centres who proceed to pull it down. It's not unreasonable for other species to develop such coordinated hunts too. This intelligence was also put to good use in the sociality of the animals. As well as the organisation of the hunt, communication also allowed for minimising conflict within the pack too. There was a single dominant pair in the pack, but they didn't restrict breeding. Chicks born into the strict hierarchy inherited the rank of their parents, and presumably lost it should they disperse to a new pack. Despite being referred to as a pack, this is remarkably similar to spotted hyenas, and perhaps social groups of Venatosaurus should instead be referred to as clans. Whilst young at least, the chicks were still cared for by the whole pack, with the adults bringing food back to the nest until they were old enough to run with the rest of the pack. Nests were typically in the hollows beneath a giant tree, and the young were guarded by one of the lowest ranking adults. Rank and relationship were reinforced with extensive body language. Males expressed their desire for females with a signature high-tailed strut, and females expressed their interest by a similar position or their indifference by looking away with a drooped tail. Whilst the forearms were now unfeathered, the flexing of claws was still a sign of hostility, as was a straight raised tail and kicking up the earth. Submissive animals would bow, with their hands folded harmlessly into their chest. Many confrontations between rival packs ended with posturing and noise. Genuine violence was rare, and territorial boundaries were kept well marked with tree scrapes and feces. The pack encountered by the USS Venture in 1933 were Venatosaurus cervidicus, but there was another smaller subspecies on the island that would only be discovered later. Venatosaurus impavidus were half the size of their relatives, and distinguished by their rust and mahogany patterns as well as their electric blue tail. This was mainly believed to be used for sexual selection amongst males. They hunted mainly along the river valleys, and were also quite capable of taking to the trees for ambush too. They had even better night vision, and were almost entirely nocturnal. One of their principal prey items was the gar, a curious addition to Skull Island brought over by one of the generations of natives. The gar survived surprisingly well on the island without their human owners. Dark coloration and sharp senses allowed them to avoid larger threats, and their solid mass and curved horns made them a dangerous challenge for smaller predators. The original script of King Kong was written in 1996, and being so soon after Jurassic Park, there was caution to differentiate themselves from their dinosaurs. The Venatosaurus was created by Jamie Bazwarek to incorporate mammal-like features into its design, like the noticeable waist and skull shape, which was taken from an English Bull Terrier. The rounder shape was to avoid a more traditional narrow reptilian one, like those in Jurassic Park. Dog raptors, or at least partially quadrupedal ones with mammalian traits, have often lingered on the edges of spec evo, often being made from genetic tampering like the Indoraptor and the Dinocanis that possibly inspired it. Some evolved via natural processes though, such as Turok's lurker, and animals that were likely possible alternative concepts for Venatosaurus, like Asartis. Either way, it remains an interesting fledgling trope in monster design. In direct contrast to the intensely swift and social Venatosaurus, was the stationary and solitary Photodon. Despite its terrestrial lifestyle, this giant reptile was actually a derived crocodilian, the scutes along its back betraying its ancient ancestry. But despite this, it still retained many similar behaviours to extant crocodiles. It hunted in a similar way, via ambush. Replacing waterholes for game trails, having nestled into the thick leaf litter, it waited for prey to walk right into its path. Once close enough, it launched forward in the hopes of grabbing an unwary target. Photodon was neither very fast nor had much stamina, so the success of a hunt often depended on the success of the initial lunge. Photodon's hunched back appearance came from the size and power of its back legs, and the predatory leaps it made could still cover impressive ground. Photodon also had an incredibly powerful jaw, capable of shattering bone. Even if the first bite didn't kill, it could very often maim fatally. After a good hit, Photodon could often follow the blood trail and tracks of its wounded victim to either where it finally expired or had become too weak to go on. Much like other crocodilians and their predator the V-Rex, Photodon also had some ontogenetic niche partitioning. The eggs were laid near water, and the offspring lived much as neonate crocodiles do in the water, snapping up frogs and insects whilst dodging an array of larger predators. Once they'd reached a certain size, they left the water and lived exclusively in the leaf litter. Here they lived much as some monitor lizards do, grubbing through the leaf litter for invertebrate and other slow-moving prey, and hoovering up the small snacks. Adults primarily ate flightless birds and small herbivores, sometimes even taking down the occasional Ligocristus, but they also weren't above a rootle themselves if they smelt something tempting. A Photodon's keen sense of smell was every bit as important, and perhaps more so, than its sight. The ugly appearance of Photodon came from their lifestyle. In the leaf litter phase, they could often pick up infections from the masses of bacteria among the mulch, and whilst rarely fatal, these could often permanently disfigure the animals, leaving them with a mass of cruel scars as deep as the bone, or an unpleasant mass of malformed scales. Photodon was originally known as the Wetasaur in production, and many of the squat reptiles throughout Skull Island likely began as designs for it too, as well as the coastal carnivores Monstrotalpus and the bear croc are also likely candidates. and Peter Jackson specifically selected the final design for its primordial appearance and pockmarked face to fit the horror show vibe he wanted for the island. The forests were also a sanctuary to dozens of species hiding from extinctions, and often had the last individuals of ancient taxa. Avarasaurus appeared to be a spinosaur, one that had left the piscivorous lifestyle to become a forest generalist, eating everything from carrion to live prey, fungi to rotting fruit. A tenacious attitude and brute strength kept it safe from most other jungle predators. Aetocurosaurus was the last stegosaur, clinging to survival in the ferny forest valleys deep in the island interior. They lived in small matriarchal herds, shadowed by larger satellite bulls constantly checking for an opportunity to impress the dominant female and mate. Whilst they managed to hang on through vast changes in vegetation and climate that reduced their diversity back in the Mesozoic, the increased competition from the loss of the land mass on Skull Island was depressing their numbers. These dinosaurs only ate certain types of plants, and primarily ferns, and when these were also being consumed by the more generalist grazers, the stegosaurs found themselves being squeezed out. On top of this, the very ferns they ate were themselves being outcompeted by other species of plants. This also potentially mirrors the fate of the stegosaur family at the end of the Jurassic. As they underwent a swift decline in abundance and diversity, so too did cycadophyte plants. It's been hypothesized that stegosaurs specialized in such fare and were doomed from the changes in the plant life between the two geological periods. Maybe the story of Aetocurosaurus was the same of that of its family, just writ small. Even if the island hadn't sank, they almost certainly would have been doomed. Sauropods also lived in the dense forest, albeit at considerably smaller sizes than the enormous brontosaurs. Aspidorsus was one such animal. Long-legged and high-bellied, it could weave its way through narrow trees to feed on the mid-level vegetation unreachable to others. This not only allowed them the freshest leaves, but also the first pick of seasonal fruits, whereas most other large herbivores could only wait until they'd dropped and began to rot. The Aspidorsus would meander their way through the forests in a slow-motion migration, following a seasonal feast of the different yearly blooms the various trees had to offer. The males advertised their strength to females by thrashing down nearby vegetation with their tails. The larger the arena of destruction, the more impressed she'd be. Not as large as the brontosaurs for protection, Aspidorsus relied on armour instead. Its hide was laden with bony scutes, making it near impenetrable. The spines along its neck weren't flimsy display structures but solid bone, with a sharp cartilaginous sheath. Even subadult V-Rex displayed the rare sense to leave them alone, rather than risk getting impaled. Some predators were game though, and a pack of Venatosaurus could occasionally either herd one to its doom or bring it down via coordinated attrition. A pair of carvers working in tandem could also pull one to ground with cunning and brawn. All were weary from a strike from its tail though, which could break bone just as well as trees. Aspidorsus is a possible descendant of either Amargasaurus or Barhardosaurus, who had similarly impressive defensive structures on their necks. Whilst a lot of fossil animals with such spines often indicate a muscular hump, in these sauropods it was much more likely to be a series of bony crests. The keratinous sheath likely growing out of them also meant they would have grown to incredible lengths too, and would have been an intimidating structure. Why Aspidorsus evolved to grow these along their back and underside of the neck over the top is unknown, but it may have evolved in tandem with the predators they had to face. Taller than its opposition and rarely lowering its head to feed, armouring its flank and underside was the more beneficial trait, preventing mobile attackers from leaping onto its back or seizing its long throat. Amargasaurus and Barhardosaurus were both dicraeosaurids, a family of Cretaceous sauropods known for their short necks. This is likely the family Diablosaurus comes from. Despite its rhinoceros-like appearance, it was actually a heavily derived sauropod. Dicraeosaurus itself has an incredibly short neck, and so the further shortening for a forest environment isn't so unreasonable, especially with the further reduction in body size. Millennia of evolution had also given it anchor points for muscular mammal-like lips as well, and the growth of impressive horns. Both males and females sported a pair as well as their ruddy heads, with males having the larger and more impressive horns. At between 20 and 25 feet, laden with tough scutes and brandishing a pair of horns, it's no surprise Diablosaurus were only rarely preyed upon. Only the bravest groups of Venatosaurus would consider taking them, or the most foolish. And singly, a carver could only hope to take a juvenile. Herbivores needed such protection in a forest filled with exotic predators, and Scimitodon was one such killer. An agile arboreal therapsid, it used speed and stealth to hunt birds and lizards both on the ground and in the trees. Powerful and stocky for their size, they readily hunted the large flightless birds that abounded in the jungle too. This also gave them great athletic ability, and they could cover 20 feet in a single bound. Not bad for an animal of only 8 or 9 feet itself. In areas of dense canopy, Scimitodon could travel for miles without even touching the floor. They lived mainly solitary lives, only coming together to mate and rear their offspring. The female incubated the eggs, whilst the male hunted for food to bring back. At 4 months, the pups left the den, and at this age the father also left the family to return to a solitary existence. The young would then follow the mother to learn from her as she hunted. Only at the start of the next breeding season did she drive them away. Their lethal scimitars were only fully grown at 1 year of age, and for many of their victims could kill in a single bite. Impressive as Scimitodon were, they were just delicate kittens compared to their massive relatives, Charocarpta interfecta, or more commonly known as carvers. With the largest individuals reaching 33 foot long, carvers were the main competition to Tartarosaurus for second place in the island's largest carnivores. As dexterous as they were powerful, anything was on the menu for these limber hunters. And if one wasn't bad enough for the jungle herbivores, carvers mated for life, formed strong pair bonds, and often hunted in pairs. Carvers were primarily nocturnal, and with good eyesight and even better hearing and smell, trying to avoid them was difficult at best. But their real edge in discovering hidden prey was a specialized heat-sensitive organ on the end of their nose. Like various species of vipers, this could sense the thermal contrast between the prey's body heat and the surrounding environment, and made trying to hide impossible. Carvers were protective of their kills, and dragged them for miles to a defensible position. Here the two would feast at leisure, eating and dozing around the carcass until it was completely consumed. Their powerful jaws could also crush bone, leaving nothing left for any jungle scavengers. Some of the regular prey items included Pugiodorsus, perhaps the most common small herbivore on Skull Island. At 10 foot, they still made a worthwhile meal for most carnivores. Whilst not especially fast, they were very wary, and had sharp senses. Would-be predators needed great stealth to get close enough for a kill, even at night, especially with their bladed backs necessitating a bite to the stomach or neck. Hebiosaurus was another frequent food item, and was slow-moving and myopic. Despite this, it was a difficult kill. Large, low to the ground and very stable, it had a thick hide and a thicker neck. All of these made it far tougher than most of the prey items. Even for a pair of carvers, Hebiosaurus was a notable effort to take down, and much like other truculent prey items like boars or buffalo, they tended to die slowly and messily. For 20 foot of good meat though, it was a worthwhile endeavour. A common sight in the forests was silver ceratops, also known informally as the treetops. They were only half the length of a Feructus, but a fraction of the weight. They had tall, lithe limbs, and crests that pressed flat against their back as they ran to avoid snagging on the trees and vines. Unsurprisingly, it was speed they relied on to escape, and in a straight sprint they could easily leave a Venatosaurus or Carver in the dust. They had excellent grip and impeccable balance too, and could jink and zigzag through the trees with an agility few could match. Only working as a cohesive team could Venatosaurus catch them, and Carvers often utilised an ambush from above. The slower, less coordinated youngsters were the most frequent victims. Only in the breeding season would bulls stand their ground in defence of their eggs. Herds were formed mainly of small families and occasional newcomers, and they were far less territorial than their burly cousins. Whilst the males competed for dominance in the breeding season, they lived in harmony throughout the rest of the year. When the season came, the males developed brilliant coloration across their crests, and grew short, curved horns that shed at the end of the period. The males would grapple and joust with them, attempting to floor their opponent in a contest that was as much balance as brute strength. Along with a handful of other species, Silverceratops exhibits peculiar traits among Skull Island dinosaurs in that they had become far more mammal-like in morphology than bird-like. Their gracile limbs with digitigrade feet, the horns that are better described as antlers as their shed. It's hard to suggest what the selective traits may be that prompted such changes, or if it's a different case for each species. But with ice ages, droughts, and far worse behind them, it shows that dinosaurs were capable of adapting to a variety of huge changes in the Earth. Cynodonts were another family of animals that had survived such turmoil in the Earth. and Dinocainosaurus was one of them. Small social predators, they depended on each other for food and defense. The packs were typically formed of a dozen adults and as many pups, with a single matriarch as the leader. In a good hunting year, all the females in the pack may breed and rear offspring, but in times of hardship, the dominant female would destroy the eggs or hatchlings of other females to secure resources for her own young. Offspring were born in shallow dens scraped out beneath trees or rocks in the forest floor, and were heavily guarded by the pack. As at only 3 or 4 foot long, the little predators were vulnerable to larger carnivores in the jungle, but sharp senses and a good top speed kept them out of harm's way for the most part. Dinocainosaurus communicated with various snorts and whistles as they moved along the forest floor, and this is an interesting parallel to a relatively unknown type of wild dog called a dhole. Also known as the Indian or Asiatic wild dog, they're sometimes dubbed the whistling hunters for the distinctive calls they make as they traverse the dense forests of Asia. These help the pack stay in touch in thick environments with poor visibility. And on top of this, acoustic study shows that each dhole has its own unique vocal profile with its whistle. If Lycaosaurus were the spotted hyena or wolf analogue of the open lowlands, then with their compact builds, great agility and unique calls, Dinocainosaurus were the dhole analogue of the Skull Island forests. A common prey for the little cynodonts was the flightless birds. Mercifully less predatory than the heavyweight brutes of the open lowlands, they often preferred insects or fruits in abundance on the forest floor. One such species was Haliornis. With its long, well-muscled legs, it could run at a speed that put most hunters to shame, and the same forces could deliver a solid kick when cornered too. Noctupovagus took a different approach, and used camouflage to hide its young. Their eggs were covered in a rich membranous coating that encouraged the growth of spores and mosses. Within a day or two, the eggs were covered in a layer of tiny plants that camouflaged them to perfection. The only downside was the chicks often needed parental assistance to escape the knotted mass that had grown around their eggs once it was time to hatch. As the name suggests, Noctupovagus was a nocturnal forager, and especially fond of centipedes. With strong legs and a saw-toothed bill, it made short work of their armour, and was able to remove their venomous mouthparts with surgical dexterity when feeding. The largest of the jungle fowl was Pinatono, a moa-like giant that appeared outwardly defenceless. Any predator that took a bite, though, was in for an unpleasant time. A quarter of Pinatono's diet was a berry with hot, noxious flesh. Immune to its belly-searing qualities, Pinatono gut-loaded the fruit, and as a result a foul-smelling gas that stung the eyes and nose rose from the pores, breath and feces of the bird. If this wasn't enough, it could regurgitate its stomach contents and spray them with alarming accuracy, causing great pain to the eyes and sensitive regions of any would-be attacker. Any easy meal in Skull Island's rainforests were often not what they seemed. Fungi was the rich resource of the forest floor, and Monstratolpus was its chief consumer. A strong sense of smell led it to its dinner like a truffle hog, and broad spade-like front feet helped it dig out the choicest specimens. Flat spatula-like teeth cut through roots and tubers, and broad molars could crush near anything. Females emitted a unique musk to draw in males, and for days in the breeding season she'd have an escort of numerous competing males for her attention. Serving as both predators and prey, Skull Island had a rich guild of huge endemic centipedes that inhabited every layer of the forest. Megapede horridus was one of the largest at 4 foot long, and was equipped with powerful legs to grapple onto prey before its venom took hold. Gaius was a specialised egg-eater, with huge mandibles to hold and crack the egg so it could lap up the escaping fluid. Megapede deriponensis was the largest centipede on Skull Island, a 5-foot predator that hunted for dinosaur chicks and other small prey with a venomous bite. It nested in rotten logs, chewing channels into the pulpy wood to create a nest for their developing offspring. Megapede hummus was a chunky burrower, bulldozing slowly through the leaf litter in search of other invertebrates or rats. There were also the arboreal species. Eidolon elotus raced among branches and vines as a treetop sprinter, killing its prey within seconds with a fast-acting venom. Eidolon veniforcus preferred the opposite, and lay in ambush protected by its dark coloration. It ate mainly lizards and spiders, and shared its relatives' potent venom. Omnimatosemex harptiforceps was the largest tree dweller. It preyed on the young and defenceless, chicks of either birds or non-avian dinosaurs when still in the nest. A single good kill could last it for weeks, and it marked its prey with a pungent odour to ward off potential thieves as it consumed them inside and out. A vast array of other endemic invertebrates also lived in the tropical rainforest. Some were island-wide inhabitants and some were endemic to only a single tree. Nox mucus was a voracious hunter and protector of the trees, as it hunted down its favoured prey, sap snails. It used its bizarre mouthparts to prise off the mollusks and then suck out their juices. Unguarculus males took the ultimate sacrifice for their offspring, allowing their eggs to be laid upon them. Here they'd stay until they hatched and ate their father alive. Some more conventional invertebrates also lived among the trees. Imputextor was known as the Wicked Weaver, an ornate, shiny orb weaver that for all intents and purposes wasn't really that dissimilar to other species. What did differ was its prey, and the flizzards of Skull Island were occasional victims. Less conventional was Sticholithus, a spider that was 12 foot long. Again, it could be argued that for all intents and purposes, the only real difference between it and other weavers was its preferred prey, here counting of dinosaurs, avian or non-avian. Flightless birds and Pugiodorsus were common victims as they blundered into it. With a spider that ate dinosaurs, if there was ever a single animal that exemplified nature's insanity on Skull Island, Sticholithus was it. Not all denizens of the canopy were quite so unpleasant though, and one of the more appealing residents was the burglar monkey. Despite its name, it was actually a close relative of lorises and tarsiers, and like them was completely nocturnal. Their days were spent curled up in the holes of trees to escape the numerous savage predators, only emerging at dusk to feed on flowers, fruits, and small animals. Then there were the brilliant flizzards, an obvious nickname for the flying lizards. Among the most brilliant was the feathered devil, Pinatodemus pernix. Some of its scales had begun to develop into feathers, and it could flit from tree to tree with the greatest agility of any lizard, easily pursuing prey between the branches or giving a predator the slip. The males would bark, and did so to communicate like geckos. At certain times of the year, the whole forest rang with the calls of the tiny lizards claiming the best branch. Many flizzards were descended from agamas, and were perhaps some of the most colourful and intriguing residents of the canopy. The Elutosaurus genus dominated, with several different species flying between the trees like gems of the rainforest. A sanguidea was the most common of the bunch, and males intimidated one another with an array of thorns on their head and whip-like tails. A cinnabarus was a daring little hunter, and followed in the wake of large dinosaurs to snatch the disturbed insects they flushed. The largest was A. peregrandis, but at 13 inches long this wasn't much to write home about. The males often locked their horns in combat to try and force an opponent off their territorial branch, jousting and shoving like tiny ceratopsians. A. centilla was a berry-eating specialist, showing off their bright red colorations to impress females. Aleposaurus ferox was a close relative of the family, distinguished by its unique structure of winged feet. Novosaurus biscuita were a unique and bizarre genus of many frills and fans, and chiefly only ate butterflies and moths. The Aerosaurus verdens was another separate lineage, with fanned hands and feet much more similar to that of a flying frog. Almost as weird as flying lizards were the herbivorous chameleons. Over time they'd made the switch from bugs to high-energy fruits and sap. But with that said, all species would still occasionally supplement their diet with the occasional insect. Finally, the treetops also had their own array of brilliant birds found nowhere else. The martial parrot was a handsome species, and one of the few parrots on the island that didn't take to carrion. The darkwing had evolved as Skull Island's woodpecker, despite being from a different family of avians, just as the tiny bright bird wasn't a true hummingbird, but actually descended from Indonesian swifts. The Skull Island hawk was a potent predator of the skies, and the bane of any flizzard. The Skull Island hornbill was a large species completely immune to the venom of the various centipedes, which it consumed with relish. The dapper crow was a rare, colourful corvid, and a true jungle opportunist, just like the rest of its intelligent family. Latticing the southern half of the island were deep fissures and chasms, a consequence of the same activity that created and would later destroy the landmass. Geothermal activity and regular rainfall kept these caverns humid and warm, and deep springs disgorged tepid, mineral-rich water that mixed with the surface runoff and detritus from above to form a nutrient-dense slop. The vast grottos and underground rivers were then open to colonization by the creatures of the forest, and in these rancid hollows the invertebrates ruled. A tenacious raft of opportunists, detritivores and predators had evolved from once diminutive insects and parasites to hold court in the great chasms. The ecosystem was well fed from above. The constant bioturbation of the pre-existing leaf litter in the rainforest ensured that the rich mulch was constantly flowing over the sides as a steady source of nutrients. But carrion was the real bounty. Desperate prey fleeing the assorted hunters of the jungle that skidded over the edge. Overzealous predators themselves unable to stop in time that capsized in. Playful youngsters ignoring a mother's contact calls that lost their footing. Or territorial fighters that succeeded in toppling an opponent over the side. The various logs and dead trees were also treacherous, especially when wet or rotten, and one slip would see an unfortunate dinosaur plunging to its doom. Decarnocemax was one of the beefier residents of the chasm, and were well adapted to eat near anything. Hunters as well as scavenging detritivores, their spade-like forelimbs also served as bladed weapons to hook onto live prey and begin to maul it. Adult females would also drag food back to the cave walls where they bred, depositing the meal in a suitable hole before laying eggs on top of it, and sealing it up with a mucus plug. Safe from the other ravening denizens of the cavern, the young would feed on the carcass until mature enough to gnaw their way to freedom. Oversized relatives of crickets, the forelimbs of Decarnocemax betrayed its most likely ancestor as a type of mole cricket. As the name implies, they live mainly as burrowers, and their primitive leaf litter and rich soil of the island may have been their ancestral home, until they fell over the side of the chasm not long after its creation. Mole crickets as a family are generalists, being herbivores and carnivores and everything in between. It's then not unlikely that at least one species would be able to carve a new and carnivorous niche in the abyss. The most common resident of the darkness was Denicrida rex, better known as the Weta rex. Related to the New Zealand species that presumably found its way to Skull Island via driftwood, some weta are gentle herbivores, like the tree weta, whereas some others, like the ground weta, are predators of leaf litter invertebrates. It's no surprise that Sod's law dictated that the carnivorous species was almost certainly the one to make it to Skull Island. They also no longer ate just small prey, but lived as a swarm of ravenous carnivores that would attack near anything. The largest inhabitant of the chasms by sheer mass was Deplector, a giant land crab that lived in the fissured walls of the Great Cracks. Lacking eyes, many of what appeared to be the vines that crisscrossed the chasms were actually the long antennae of the Deplectors. Incredibly sensitive to disturbances in the air, they keyed in the giant crustaceans to movements of either anything trying to climb in or out of the chasms, or to the assorted nocturnal flying animals that often made up the bulk of their diet, especially the tiny vulturesaurs. Deplector prevented themselves from pitching too far over by anchoring themselves to rock with elastic secretions. This not only kept them fastened in place with no energetic expenditure, but allowed them to spring back from their lunges too. If necessary, these could be snipped away so the crab could move to a new home. Deplectors also had some of the most extreme sexual dimorphism on the island, with the tiny males being a fraction of the size of the females. They exhibited pedomorphism and never grew out of their hatchling forms. They were small, pale, soft-shelled, and defenseless. Their safety came from the giant females. The males lived at the back of the caves, fertilizing the hundreds of eggs laid by their mates, in exchange for the safety provided. Once hatched, the young flooded en masse into the canyons to decide their own fates, leaving the parents behind. Smaller cousins of Deplector also lived in the chasms. Abyssidis was a scavenging land crab common across the floors of the abyss. They shared the primordial soup with other invertebrates for breeding, forming loose colonies around the canyons. Perhaps the most repulsive inhabitants of the fissures were Carnictis. It's believed the ancestors of Carnictis lived in the intestines of giant theropods, like the animals that would one day become Vastatosaurus, where they feasted on half-digested dinosaur meat originally eaten by their great hosts. When the predators fell into the chasm to their doom, the emerging worms found themselves in the warm organic slurry of the pits, not so dissimilar to the bowels of the giant dinosaurs. Tapeworms as a family aren't what you'd call dynamic. They can barely move, they anchor themselves to the wall of the intestine with a head like Scolex, and absorb oxygen and nutrients through the microvilli on their body. Platyhelminths, which are perhaps broadly more known as flatworms, is the family they belong to, and some types of them can hunt, and there are a number of predatory families of them. But even then, consumption often consists of them inverting their stomach around the prey, over swallowing it whole with a genuine mouth. The Carnictis we see has a retractable proboscis-like head, similar to that of something like an Arctic scale worm. Annelids, and especially leeches, will swallow prey in a more typical fashion, and despite their blood-sucking reputation, half of them are actually predatory over parasitic, and swallow other annelid species whole. So overall, the evolutionary potential is there. For Carnictis to transform from a limp rope of absorbent biomass to the toothy slithering stomach it became when a group accosted the crew of the Venture, it just likely took several millennia for it to happen. Carnictis are greatly limited in range, and could only live in the warm syrupy pits of the Skull Island chasms. If one were to move downstream into the more open rivers, where fresh, cool and clean water replaced the living soup it lived in, it would spell death for the worms. The cold water quickly drained their life. Whilst they were warmed by their home and could go for great lengths without food, adult Carnictis could still starve, and if the meat supply was cut off for too long, the adults would be devastated. Their eggs, however, could last for decades in a dormant state, lying in wait for favourable conditions in which to hatch. The Carnictis had several designs, from the more traditional worms to a more cave salamander-like animal, with Jackson unsurprisingly selecting the grossest one. But the meat weasel also represents something more interesting in the notion of Parasite Rex, a former dependent that can now not only stand on its own 2 feet, but had evolved to become aggressive and predatory. Fiction has had beasts with parasitic life stages, or parasites that develop their own advanced cultures, but Carnictis may be unique in having the journey from parasite to pure predator. It also suffered the fate of many predators, and a great irony, that it had become parasitized itself. The arachnoclaws were large predatory arthropods that laid hundreds of microscopic eggs in the carrion that fell from above. Many drowned in the mulch or were destroyed by the consumption of other feeders, but a lucky handful survived long enough to be ingested by Carnictis. They would spend years attached to its intestinal lining, living off the meat it ate, just as its ancestors had done millions of years ago inside the tyrannosaurs. Once mature, they would metamorphose inside the giant worm, and emerge from its rectum as miniature adults, to live their lives as scavengers and predators of Skull Island's most macabre ecosystem. The great spine of Skull Island was the mountainous ridge that ran its crooked length. Rising above the dense green carpet of the rainforest, it was frequently battered by strong winds and heavy rains that pruned back the forests attempting to colonize it. Far cooler than the rest of the island too, only more specialized plants grew here. The handful of trees that could cling to the barren rocks became a primitive cloud forest, and were in turn home to a myriad of epiphytes like bromeliads and orchids, whereas the wetter rocks were carpeted with good layers of moss and ferns fed by condensation. As much rock as sky, the wind-blown uplands were home to a number of unique animals, either graceful featherweights that could skip over stone and gorge, or robust brutes clinging to the mountains with an iron grip. It was in this landscape of buffering winds and grand vistas that the last of the great apes retreated to make his refuge, a bleak hermitage for a lonely king. And among the king's court in the mountains dwelled the lord of the Skull Island skies, and it was no bird of prey or pterosaur or even a bat, but a flying rodent, known as Pteropus mordax. As the largest, most predatory and most aggressive from the family of winged rodents on the island, much of Pteropus mordax's prey consisted of its smaller family. Howlers, a noisy flying rodent of the rainforests, were occasionally taken, and the misnamed Skull Island white bats were eaten by both. Vulturesaurs, the tiny winged reptiles that were often mistaken for bats, were too a common prey, as were Voluceratus when the pungent predators hunted over the lowlands. Draco, a highland species of gliding lizard, was snatched if it stayed out too long after dusk, and it was also sought after as a quick snack by any of the mountain predators. Sharp eyes and quick reflexes kept it safe from most, though. Pteropus mordax would also occasionally hunt by driving prey into the caverns, where the knotted vines would prevent its escape. This was a risky move though. Fly too close to the wrong vine and the winged hunter may itself become snared by a deplector. Outside of that, Pteropus mordax rarely suffered predation themselves though. As they hung upside down from the mountain caves they slept in, a layer of their feces built up beneath them, and created a stench that burned noses and watered eyes. They would also occasionally have underbellies caked in excrement, so in the event of anything catching them, it would often let go very quickly. This toxic build-up also protected the colony and the young, and almost no montane predator was willing to risk the nauseating reek of the colony for a few stringy mouthfuls of feces-smeared meat. But the cave floors did hold one dark secret for unwary pups: Megapede impurus, a venomous 3-foot centipede that dwelled in the crevasses around Pteropus mordac's nests. Whenever a pup fell, it would be quick on its heels, and wounded individuals or ones too slow to begin the climb back of the wall, or to be collected by their mother, would be eaten. Centipedes are frequent predators of actual bats, and often dwell around the caves to predate them. The man-sized Pteropus mordac's adults were too large to be taken, but dead individuals helped keep the megapedes fed until the next clumsy pup. Another threat to the young Pteropus mordax was an adult male. The young male individuals were driven away as subadults, and lived in small satellite colonies away from the main flock. They fought frequently and often bore infected wounds. These colonies weren't set social organisations, but transient, as new youngsters attempting to join were often just killed and eaten. As such, females greatly outnumbered males in the population. Not only did males predate the pups, but the selective infanticide also brought the mothers back into estrus. The females themselves were awash with male hormones, making them as large and aggressive as the male sex. Despite this, the matriarchal colonies regularly groomed one another, foraged in groups, and shared the raising of their offspring. It may be tempting to compare them with spotted hyenas in this regard, but those intelligent carnivores arguably have a more advanced social system, one also more inclusive of males, and with as much infanticidal competition between the females themselves. So much like with some aspects of the Brontosaurus, these behaviours are somewhat localised to Skull Island, despite the initial temptation of a real-world analogue. A distant relative of the Pteropus mordax was the skin bird. Despite its name, it was actually a rodent too, its incisors having formed into a pseudo-beak at the front of its mouth. Pure carnivores, they were not as adept as others in the Flying Rodent Guild and performed far better as gliders. Prey was thus never caught on the wing, and they often landed to forage for small prey. One such victim was Pteropus mordax pups. Skinbirds were one of a rare handful of animals on the island not bothered by their stench, and brave individuals would often penetrate the reeking caverns to snatch a youngster. It was no surprise female Pteropus mordax met skinbirds with hostility on sight. The Pteropus mordax went through more redesigns than any other creature on Skull Island, with Peter Jackson insisting it to be made to look more diseased and ugly with each new take. Infected looking was the word he kept on using. Once the body had been decided on, the head went through 30 different renditions. The Howler, Skinbird and Pugbat all had maquettes originally made for Pteropus mordax, before the final and more bat-like rendition was settled upon. The mountains were home to more than just winged animals though, and as well as carnivores and herbivores, a few generalist omnivores lived in the highlands too. The bear croc was an omnivorous reptile known for its booming calls that could be heard for miles. An enhanced larynx and reverberating chambers in its gut allowed for deafening calls to minimise competition. A thick tail full of fat also helped them survive the lean period, though they could eat near anything. But as ever on Skull Island, there was the risk of being eaten themselves, and Malevollosaurus was one such opportunistic predator of the highlands. It scavenged carrion from other predators, or even the prey as they were busy pulling it down, ambushed swift prey and dug out smaller animals from their burrows, and in times of hunger would even uproot plants for their roots and tubers. The distinctive sail betrayed its Permian ancestry, and no longer in the warm ancient swamps of their ancestors, Malevollosaurus employed theirs to warm themselves in the early morning for a day of forage. It was rare to see one with an intact sail, as struggles for dominance between these territorial brutes were common. The males even bore knobbled crowns to butt each other with too. Malevollosaurus laid their eggs on the sunniest slopes of the hottest season where they'd be naturally warmed. The greatest threat was their parents, and over 3/4 of the numerous young were eaten by adults in their first year of life. Luckily, once they reached adult size, little else would touch them. Only the saber-toothed gladiodon would hunt an adult Malevollosaurus, and even then it was a risky order. Chaliceratops were ceratopsians that grazed the lower hills that bordered the jungles, and specialised in feeding on the subalpine vegetation. This unique niche made them the rarest ceratopsians on the island, but come the breeding season they weren't hard to find, Despite only being about half the size of their closest relative, the Feructus, they were arguably even more fierce. The impacts of their clashes rang throughout the valleys as the males butted and jousted. All old bulls bore broken horns and frequent scarring, and in their fights there was rarely a grace period or backing down. Such conflicts were most commonly to the death. The complete opposite to Chaliceratops was Bifurcatops, the smallest and most delicate in the island's ceratopsians. Related to the treetops, though they made even Silverceratops look robust in comparison, and at 6 to 10 foot long they could nimbly traverse their mountain homes. Their distinct horseshoe horns and crest were too delicate for combat, and the males engaged in dance to impress the females, bowing and swaying before them to display their balance and sure-footedness, far more important traits than brute strength on the roof of the world. This also allowed them to reach and graze nearly any plant on the slopes and crags, making them the most numerous mountain herbivores. If there was one animal that could match the grace and agility of Bifurcatops, it was Asarticades, better known as just Asartis, a heavily derived dromaeosaur that had become racy quadrupeds, and the primary hunters of the gracile ceratopsian herds. It's hard to fathom why and how a dromaeosaur would become quadrupedal, but it almost certainly occurred due to its mountain environment. One theory for the origin of flight in birds was wing-assisted incline running, or WARE. It was developed after watching subadult chukar partridges still using their wings to help them scale inclines, but without using true flight. It's since mostly fallen out of favour, with most people accepting the tree down hypothesis, but maybe this has some weight for Asartis' origins. The same flapping notion being used to climb could over time result in the clawed forelimbs being important for purchase, as well as stabilisation in montane environments. Such selective pressures could then result in longer, robust cursorial limbs too. It's also mentioned Asartis uses its forelimbs in anchoring itself to prey as well. So they became of less use for stability in killing, like earlier dromaeosaurs, and of equal or possibly even greater use than the hind limbs for prey dispatch. Either way, Asartis remains one of the more unique residents of the island. A smaller predator was Bidensaurus, a dog-sized carnivore closely related to Lycaosaurus of the lowland valleys. It was mainly solitary though, only pairing for a few months in the breeding season, and it preferred small or medium prey over pack-hunting large animals. So perhaps if Lycaosaurus was the wolf or the hyena, and Dinocaenosaurus the dhole, Bidensaurus was the coyote or jackal of Skull Island. Its close relative was a lot larger and more predatory, Gladiodon. Whilst it may have appeared something of a dandy, with its feather-like dorsal fans and fiery stripes, it was a top predator of the mountains, regularly taking either Bifurcatops or Chaliceratops. It was also an aggressive intragilled predator. Its saber teeth were used to inflict a single huge bloody wound near a major artery or vein, and then the animal would back off to follow the blood trail at leisure. Gladiodon had elaborate courtship, and the males lekt. Groups would gather together to strut and pose, showing off their mass and shaking their dorsal fans with frequent yawns to showcase their enormous canines too. The females would wander about the group looking for the finest specimen to pick. It's interesting that the chief hunters of the highlands are synapsids, rather than theropods like most of the island's regions. Malevolosaulus's ancestors came from the Permian, and it's likely that it and Enox were among the very first animals to live on the landmass that would later become the island, and there was once mostly low-lying wetland like the Everglades. It's unknown what drove the Dimetrodon and the other assorted synapsids from the swamps. It could have been competitive exclusion from any number of animals, dinosaurs or other synapsids, Photodon's ancestor or Pteranodon, or something completely unrelated to any of them. But whatever the change, it's possible that it permitted Diplocaulus to become larger and more predatory Enox, as fossils show Dimetrodon may well have predated the hammer-headed amphibians. It's interesting then too, that the oldest residents of Skull Island would share the mountains with one of the newest, and that was its king, Megapromatus Kong. Unique among Skull Island's wildlife, sadly, in that the species was already functionally extinct by the time the West discovered the island, and would later be completely extinct on a winter morning of 1933 when the last male specimen was killed by fighter planes atop the Empire State Building. The origins of the greatest of apes appear unknown. It's suggested that they didn't naturally colonise the island and were brought over by some of the earliest humans who later settled on Skull Island themselves. The suggested ancestor of Kong is Gigantopithecus, the largest ape known and now believed to be similar to a giant orangutan. Gigantopithecus is known from mainly fossil teeth and a jaw from China, but it's been suggested that they may have lived in the Indochina region and Indonesia as well. It's possible but unlikely that apes somehow made it over themselves, possibly on rafts of vegetation or by other means. Either way, with the sinking of their home, the origins of Kong will likely remain a mystery forever. Despite their more orangutan-like ancestry, in both appearance and behaviour, Megapromatus Kong was believed to be much more similar to the gorilla genus. There are effectively two flavours of gorilla, mountain and lowland, and Kong was likely much more similar to a mountain. With a diet of mainly herbaceous plants, and especially the more protein or energy-rich roots, shoots and stems of them, this also fits with a small data point we get in film when we see Kong selecting to eat bamboo shoots. Mountain gorillas also live in relatively small, cohesive family groups, with strong relationships between the silverback and the adult females. Whilst it can vary, more often than not these groups will have a single adult male, with the other adults being his sons hanging on until they finally decide to disperse. From the bones of specimens found and what could be learned from native ruins, it's believed this was the case with Kong as well. It seemed the giant primates slept in the mountains and uplands and then descended upon the forest to feed, and this fits with other species of primates that live in predator-dense environments. Baboons will sleep in tall structures as out of the way of nocturnal predators as they can find, and wherever possible, cliffs are preferred for the steep slopes that make attacking a troop near impossible. Megapromatus was no doubt far too large to sleep in trees, and if it nested on the rainforest it would have had to use the jungle floor, which would expose them to predators. Whilst the large males had astonishing power, this would be useless at night when they were vulnerable and blind. In both types of gorillas, even adult males have been killed at night by surprise attacks from leopard, which are barely half their size. Carnivores with excellent night vision like carvers and Venatosaurus would be able to run rings around even the strongest silverbacks, and wear them down for the kill. But to extract an untenable toll on the species they wouldn't have to. Simply by picking off the young, they would hamstring the population recruitment of groups, and send them into a decline with natural adult mortality. The breeding females would also be a very severe loss to any group, and almost be as vulnerable as the youngsters. It's possible this is what led to the giant size of the apes. Research into sexual dimorphism of primates shows that with gorillas specifically the males grew larger to combat predators, which resulted in them being unable to regularly partake in arboreal activity, which meant that it was no longer a factor limiting growth and allowed them to grow larger still. With such a large and dangerous guild of predators on Skull Island to defend themselves from, the need for predator defense resulted in the already giant apes growing larger still until they became the Megapromatus Kong, with silverbacks being a match for the assorted theropods and therapsids on the island. The most frequent challenger to the silverback's troops was Vastatosaurus rex. The final male of Skull Island was not an anomaly, and the numerous bones of its predecessors in the mountains show that this conflict was one that had gone on for centuries, with good numbers of the adult apes receiving bone-deep wounds that would never heal. Whilst it may be tempting to describe the two species as having a rivalry, the reality of such interactions was often far simpler, in that the tyrannosaurs simply viewed the apes as food, especially the females and youngsters. In return, Megapromatus Kong were understandably hostile to the V-Rexes on sight, and would even kill young individuals if they got the chance to eliminate future threats. There was no resource the two competed over, it was just primal aggression. Subadult V-Rex, more often frequenting the forests in a rush to claim their own territory and laden with teenage confidence, were often in direct conflict with the troops. Despite the power and savagery of the two species, it was rare for adults to succeed in killing their opponent. The huge gin-trap jaws of the V-Rex were impressive weapons all on their own, and the great apes were strong, dexterous and smart enough to use tools to even the playing field. Clashes were short and savage wounds common, but one party typically backed down when the odds began to tip out of their favour. Only rarely did the stakes become high enough for the struggle to escalate to life and death. King Kong himself was a veteran fighter, and was able to take on a pair of adult V-Rex and one subadult not through brawn, but brains, which was the greatest advantage the apes had over the dinosaurs. Kong used the broken terrain to his advantage, splitting up his opponents after neutralising the easiest target first and quickest with tool use, when he crushed its head beneath a boulder. If not for the chasm he flung the two adults into, It's questionable how long even the king may have been able to last against a pair of adult Vastatosaurus, but by taking the fight to the vines he was able to divide and conquer, using far greater mobility to fight them one at a time in an environment that far better suited him, and also allowed him to kill the most dangerous target, the bull. Again, the final showdown may have been a lot more dangerous if he hadn't left himself with the more elderly matriarch, Rex. The final confrontation shows Kong's most important trick, that he understood the use of controlling the jaws of the V-Rex. Gorillas, when fighting, mainly inflict their lethal damage with bites, often aimed at their opponent's head. If Megapromatus Kong was anything similar, and then tried to apply this tactic to the dinosaurs, they would almost certainly just be bowled over and killed without doing any lethal damage. Rather, the king learned not to fight like a gorilla, but to learn a new strategy. Kong was clearly experienced against the giant predators, and Peter Jackson always had the intent that Kong had met even the particular individuals in combat before, especially the adult bull, which is where he'd got some of his scars. It's also possible prior to their deaths, Kong had seen some other members of his own kind in conflict with the Vastatosaurus, and learned from their mistakes. At the end of the day, the tragedy may have been that for all their warfare, both Vastatosaurus Rex and Megapromatus Kong were doomed by the same invisible killer nurtured by their shrinking island. Kong's kind were likely never great in number, they bred seldom and aged slowly, and their own gene pool would have been increasingly poor by the end. Gorillas naturally suffer greatly from respiratory diseases, in the rainy seasons of the cold, wet mountain forests especially. It can take a real toll on their numbers, and this was likely the case on Skull Island too. Unable to permanently live in the warmer jungles due to predators, the apes roosted in the colder mountains. Sickness and age were every bit as lethal as any V-Rex or Venatosaurus pack, and an immune response limited by genetically poor populations meant that every death was a blow. Accident and attrition slowly contributed to the long defeat of Megapromatus Kong. The story of King Kong was a tragedy even before Carl Denham reached the shores of Skull Island. At that point he had already been alone for years on end. An intelligent primate used to close, long-lasting social bonds with an extended family, now instead stranded alone on an island full of enemies. It's no surprise then that he was belligerent and hostile, having turned into an aggressive loner. But this was not the animal the king had started as. Once he was likely a father and even a grandfather, with numerous mates and relatives all lost to time. The brief moment of fun and elation with Anne Darrow on the frozen lake may be the closest thing we see to the being Kong once was, rather than the pugnacious tyrant so desperate for company, but too terrifying to accept it when presented to him. In the end, it was the only sacrifice offered to him who survived that caused his doom. Anne Darrow changed him, back into a protector and able of achieving just a moment's peace once more, only for his sheer desperation to be anything but alone again to ultimately cause his demise. The World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island is now out of print to my knowledge, and despite selling very well back in the day, it's hard to find and often very expensive nowadays. I hope this, and a sprinkling of extra zoological science and behind-the-scenes making of, has been a worthwhile substitute to everyone who doesn't have their own physical copy, because as it goes I really do consider it the gold standard for this sort of world-building or speculative evolution. It would also be remiss of me to not credit those involved. Whilst I imagine everyone is aware of Peter Jackson's involvements, Daniel Falconer was the chief writer of the book and Ben Wotton its researcher. Together they also served as art directors. Wotton also made several of the wonderful landscape pieces too. Margaret Clark was its editor, and put together such a well-made book. Amanda Smart was its layout artist, who is responsible for such an aesthetically pleasing field guide. Greg Broadmoor was one of the chief artists and made many of the creature profile images, as was Christian Pearce, who made several of the landscape and portrait behavioural pieces. Gus Hunter was the cover artist and made several moody Skull Island backgrounds as well. Stephen Crow, Chris Guys and Paul Tobin were all principal illustrators on both the film and book. Daniel Reeve created the map, and Gino Acevedo, Johnny Bro, Brad Goff, Christian Gossett and David Meng were all supporting illustrators. I think most would agree to say they all did a phenomenal job across the board. And of course, in the greater making of the film itself, there are simply far too many people for me to credit here. So to slowly begin wrapping up, I think I've made it very clear I'm very fond of Peter Jackson's King Kong. It probably vies with Jurassic Park for the spot of my favourite film of all time. I'd definitely say it's probably the best realised King Kong film there is too. When I say that, I of course recognise that the original King Kong is the most important, as well as perhaps being the most significant monster movie ever made by being the first, as well as just making waves in cinema overall too. Being the film that got Peter Jackson into filmmaking, no Kong, no Lord of the Rings. It really is testament to the knock-on effect that such seminal pieces can have. With all that said, I think the effects done by the Weta Workshops, as well as the greater budget and screen time and soundtrack and acting, all mean that Jackson's King Kong is probably the overall better and more watchable film, and without doubt the best interpretation of Skull Island we've ever got too. I don't think it's sacrilege to suggest that certain films can be embellished by modern technology to become better cinema than the seminal films that inspired them. I may well just be biased from my love of the film, but I also disagree with a lot of the common complaints people have with Jackson's Kong. I acknowledge it is long, but whenever I watch it though, I really struggle to think of things hard cut that would majorly decrease the runtime, even the boat stuff. And with the extended edition, I'm fine with it as this mainly just adds more scenes of Skull Island wildlife. My main issues overall is probably the absolute halt of Jimmy's character, especially as it seems they were building to something. Some say most of the side characters get incomplete arcs, but I disagree. Baxter completes his on the island, Preston for when he fully sees Carl for what he is. It's only really Jimmy who gets a lot of build-up for no real payoff. In the extended edition he does pick up Hayes' hat, in the sort of implication he'll be the new captain I guess, but it's only really my own interpretation. But on the commentary it does seem this was sort of Jackson's intent. There's also the issue of the depiction of the islanders. For the most part I believe this is the saying, don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity. I don't think Peter Jackson hates black people, I just believe he didn't stop to think how his view of the islanders could be interpreted in his rush to take everything the first film had and dial it up to 11 as he always does. The notion of such hostile tribes is of course a false colonial narrative. But in this case, I don't really think their aggression is unjustified. Their first interaction with the crew of the Venture is just a sweaty weirdo grabbing one of their kids. Jesus, I think anyone is getting hostile over that. And despite the first scene, I feel the Skull Islanders are meant to be pitied above all else. When we see the close-ups of them kidnapping Anne, it's not aggression but fear that drives them. Both the Making of and Skull Island book mentions that they view Kong as a demigod, and their island as their god. And said island has been crumbling into the sea despite their best efforts to appease it. They're being punished for something they can't fathom that they've done, and are desperate to do anything to try and halt or avert it before their god ends them once and for all, as it sadly does. That said, I'm about as white as the background of my videos, so I'm probably not the best person to comment on this. It's just my overall thoughts. And even if supplementary material does somewhat dilute the disregard for their depiction and appearance, it's still an issue with the film. And it's no doubt the aspect of it that has aged the worst. To get back to the positives, I guess it's just the rest of the film really. This whole video has been a lot of gushing over the Skull Island part, so I don't feel I need to say too much more there. I even don't think the Brontosaurus stampede looks as bad as some say, but some of the shots of the actors' faces can definitely look a bit off. Otherwise, the extended edition provides me with effectively everything I could want from that portion of the film. I think it's borderline perfect. As a kid, I'd always fast forward to Skull Island, but as an adult, I really love everything else surrounding it too. Especially the pre-Rampage portion of New York. And especially the scene of Jack watching his own play, and having his own thoughts read back to him. It's just brilliant. Adrian Brody is fantastic as Jack. Peter Jackson mentioned he didn't want an alpha male opposing Kong. He wanted the opposite, as no matter who was cast they'd only be overshadowed by Kong, who is the ultimate alpha male. Which I really appreciate and think this was the right choice. Everyone else is also great too. Naomi Watts as the leading lady you can't really ask for a better performance from. And just how much she does without other actors to bounce off for half the film as well is incredibly impressive. Especially the final acts, which she loads with such tragedy as well. Jack Black was a weird choice, but one that really works out with how well he goes into the Orwellian madness as well. But I do like that he's still layered. He was clearly and sincerely horrified by Herb's death, who he genuinely cared about as much or even more than the camera. And at the end he's clearly horrified by what he's done, which doesn't make it so unbelievable that he wound up leading Project Legacy. I think you can make an interesting parallel between Anne and Carl too. as they both start the film in the same place, desperation, and not taking no for an answer from others that both leads them to their fateful meeting. When they get to Skull Island, Carl descends into madness, whereas Anne is the only one safe with Kong. But on the return to New York, Denham exploits Kong to get everything he wants, whereas Anne winds up in the very role she mocked in the beginning. There's a lot you can dig into there. And it really has to be said, good on everyone that they all came back for the video game adaptation too. And on that, what a game as well. Recognised by all as a video game adaptation far better than it had any right to be, it was really ahead of its time. The immersive lack of heads-up display and the use of sound and how much the game trusted you to look after yourself and adapt just made it stand out. Plus the environmental interactions were really advanced for the era as well. It's worth noting too there was a lot of communication between the game and film studios, as several enemies and concepts that didn't make the final cinematic cut of the film pop up in game too. It still stands as one of the best and most atmospheric dino shooters we've gotten. A genre that's seemingly fallen out of favour with next-gen consoles, to be replaced with the building of dino parks or dino strategies or dino simulators. I think that's a shame. Dinosaurs have great potential to re-enter the horror genre. The Jurassic Park novel was much darker and more horror-like in tone, but other than campy 90s B-movies like Carnosaur, everyone's favourite giant reptiles have never really been allowed to properly engage in R-rated mainstream media, with the exception recently of Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. And finally, on the subject of video games, I did briefly want to mention my theory that Skull Island is a reasonable inspiration for Monster Hunter from 3rd gen onwards. Monster Hunter World effectively has its own bug chasm with a rotten veil. The intro to Try is almost a shot-for-shot remake of the Brontosaurus Stampede. And there's also a lot of monsters that seem at least partially inspired by Skull Island. Photodon is a lot like Great Jaguarus, Odogron a lot like the Carvers, and so on. And especially the V-Rex. A lot of people often say that Devil Joe is inspired by Godzilla, but I think the V-Rex is a major inspiration too. The original edition of it, and a lot of its concept art, is much more similar to the V-Rex than to Godzilla, with the crocodilian-like scales and the overlapping teeth. I also wonder if Joe being able to carry monsters around was partially inspired by the juvenile Rex and the Photodon too. This is also just theory, but I think it's quite possible. Plus, there are few things better to use as inspiration than this book. And with that, I think I've said all I set out to with this video, so thank you for watching this far into it. If you're new to the channel and made it this far and actually enjoyed what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing and letting me know what you thought. And if you've already subscribed, still like and let me know. This channel focuses mainly on the assorted wildlife of the Monster Hunter franchise, but I regularly dive into other beasts as well. Primeval's future predator will be done for certain in the future as well. If you have your own suggestions or your own theories, don't hesitate to pitch in. And there's also a Discord link for meatier discussions as well. Hopefully I'll see you next time.